Good morning, everyone. I'm Alex Tock. I'm the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. And I want to welcome you all here today to the Thompson Center Summit on Early Literacy. I want to begin by thanking all of you for coming today. I especially want to thank the representatives, senators, and others from the state legislature who are here. I realize we all have busy schedules these days, and I appreciate you all taking the time to be here. This is such an important challenge we're facing, and it's really encouraging to see so much interest in understanding and addressing this issue. I also want to thank our wonderful speakers today. I want to thank Kimber. I want to thank Ruth and Mary Kate. Without all of your work, we wouldn't be here today. For those of you unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me say a few brief words. The Thompson Center was founded to follow in the footsteps of Governor Thompson, who proudly worked with both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, fostering leadership skills, and promoting effective public policy. We work to further these goals by holding events such as this one, funding research grants and scholarships, and conducting other activities across the UW system. Should add, all of our events are free and open to the public, so I encourage you to check out what else we have. I'm really proud of the lineup of speakers we have today. I'll mention them only briefly because I'd much rather listen to what they have to say, but you'll find a more complete and very impressive biography of them on one of the handouts that you came in with. Our four speakers today are Kymyona Burk, the Senior Policy Fellow for Early Literacy at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, Mark Seidenberg, a Vilas Research Professor and Donald O. Hebb Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Emily Hanford, Senior Correspondent for American Public Media, and yes, Donna Heitmanek, thank you. I should have written down that. Past president of the Literacy Task Force of Northern Wisconsin and a retired special education teacher and reading specialist. I'm really eager to learn more from all of these panelists. And it's now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Kymyona Burk to talk about Wisconsin's early literacy landscape. Dr. Burk.
Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. I have to figure out which time zone I'm in these days. Thank you all so much for being here to have this very important conversation about early literacy and especially early literacy in Wisconsin. So I'll be looking here because that's where my slides are. So we're going to talk a little bit about, I'll begin this conversation around Wisconsin's early literacy landscape and how the science of reading can serve as a catalyst for change. So why does read by 3 matter? We've heard a lot about this threshold that students must meet as they transition from 3rd grade to 4th grade, as they transition from learning to read to reading to learn. That's a real thing. I'm a former teacher, former literacy coach, former district administrator, and state leader. And the one thing that we do know is that the texts become more complex, right? The pictures are taken away. This genre that they've been used to, the stories, the climax, the characters, all of those things are taken away as students begin to learn more about content, more about science, more about social studies, more about the procedural ways that we do things, right? So children must have those foundational skills in order to be able to apply those things to new texts that they encounter. So why does it matter? There's statistics, of course, from Annie E. Casey Foundation, and even from Literacy Behind Prison Walls that speaks to the importance of reading by third grade. 88% of students who failed to earn a diploma were struggling readers in third grade. And then we begin to look at these subgroups. And I always say, you know, we have to look under the hood. We always think about our overall percentage of students, but when we look under the hood, in many cases, in many states across America, then the data just becomes more alarming. So students who are not reading proficiently in third grade, if they are 4 times more likely to not graduate high school. If African American or Hispanic, are 6 times more likely to drop out or fail to graduate high school, and if low-income minority are 8 times more likely to drop out or fail to graduate from high school. And you see this 7 out of 10 image that speaks to 7 out of every 10 inmates cannot read above a 4th grade level. And I'll talk a bit, just briefly about, you know, there was this First Step Act passed in 2018. I see some of you nodding like, yeah. It was signed into law by President Trump in 2018, and the First Step Act is trying to ensure that prisoners, that inmates are screened for characteristics of dyslexia, because that goes into determining their recidivism rate, right? How well they will be able to enter back into society when they are released from prison. And I would dare say that's not a first step, right? Shouldn't have to go to prison. Well, okay. All right. We're gonna keep it. I have to remember, it's not just us. We're streaming live. All right, so reading is not just an education issue, it's also an economic issue. A study by Gallup that was in partnership with the Barbara Bush Foundation showed that the nation could be losing up to $2.2 trillion annually because of our low adult literacy rates. And I want to talk a bit about how this impacts our students' daily lives, like their future. One thing that we know is students or children who are struggling readers can grow into adults who are struggling readers if their deficiencies are not addressed. So let's talk about everyday life. So elementary school students who are struggling readers have difficulty reading and understanding assignments, reading directions to even complete their homework, reading and solving math problems, you know, the new math, right? Writing or reading a birthday card. Now that gets personal, doesn't it? Right? You remember the Valentine's Day cards? I don't know if the kids even still do that, where they exchange the little cards on Valentine's Day. Think about a child who is a struggling reader, right? And so these children who are struggling readers grow into adolescents who will experience those same issues, and they have difficulty following instructions to complete a science experiment, passing their driver's license test, and filling out a job application. I have a 16-year-old. She started her first job at the local grocery store last summer. But think about that. And she had to complete her application online and upload a resume. I was like, you haven't even lived. How do you have a resume? But she had to upload a resume to work at the grocery store. All right, and if these difficulties are not addressed, then adolescents grow into adults who have difficulty reading their child a bedtime story. Now, how many times, especially as educators or even as community members, we always say, read with your child 20 minutes a day. Well, that's difficult for some people. And we just have an expectation that, you know, we're encouraging this, so this should happen. And why aren't you? Helping with homework, reading and completing job applications and housing applications, and completing paperwork for doctor's visits and insurance claims. So we can talk about how it impacts education, but we can also talk about how it impacts the economy, and ultimately it impacts a person's quality of life. So why the science of reading? Now, Dr. Seidenberg is going to talk a lot about that in a moment. But just think of this. The science of reading has culminated in this just preponderance of evidence where we now know how we learn to read, why some children actually have difficulty learning to read, and what we can do about it. We know today what we can do about it. So let's talk about this lovely image here. Simple view of reading. And I'm including this for the purpose of just saying that it's not just about phonics. And you've probably heard it so much, that the science of reading is phonics. It's not. It includes decoding. It also includes language comprehension. Oral language is extremely important. Opportunities for students to engage with each other, to communicate. If you walk by classrooms and they're very quiet, that's not always a good thing, right? Children need to be able to talk to each other and to do those things. So it's language comprehension, it's word knowledge, it's vocabulary, it's background knowledge, it's all of those things that go together for reading comprehension. And you see the kind of math equation, the product. And we know that it is a multiplication, which means that anything times 0 is 0. So if you have 0 in decoding, meaning that you're unable to sound out words, you're unable to look at those letters and sound out words, match sounds to letters, and do all the things to make it into a word, but you have good language comprehension. You've come from a family where you've had conversations, you've been talked to, you kind of understand vocabulary when it's spoken to you. Let's just say you have a 1 there, you have a 0 for decoding, so 0 times 1 is 0. The child is not going to reach full reading comprehension in that way. So this image is just is one that shows that both are needed. It's not an or, it's an and that teachers have to explicitly, systematically teach these skills to students so that they can become proficient readers. So let's talk about a comprehensive approach to improving literacy outcomes. I thought I had a paper towel or something. My sinuses, so I change climates all the time, so I apologize. Thank you so much. I brought the sunshine to Chicago last week too. So you noticed it showed up when I showed up, but all right, so what are the most recent forces behind this policy momentum for early literacy? Just so thankful that we have legislators here. We have those of you who are on the ground who are doing this work, those of you who are advocating for this work, and it takes all of us. So what has been this momentum behind policy across the country? Last year alone, ExcelinEd worked with 15 states to pass or protect their early literacy policies, their Read by 3 laws. Now, I attribute those things to, of course, Emily Hanford, this science of reading resurgence and the reporting that is now at dinner tables and not just at state departments of education, not just among board members or faculty or administrators, but we had parents who began listening to, when we first started with hard words, saying, oh wait, that sounds like my kid. Oh, I've been seeing my child leverage pictures, look at pictures to try to figure out words. Oh, that's not a good thing? Oh, my child is actually memorizing. They're not really reading, right? So this conversation that just had a groundswell across the country. We also have had our NAEP data. This could have been the same slide pre-pandemic as it is today, right? So we know from the pandemic that we've lost about 2 decades of progress. That's a lot of progress, right? Post-pandemic, also there's been dyslexia-focused reform on the federal level with U.S. Senator Cassidy out of Louisiana that's really been pushing to ensure that dyslexia, the 21st Century Dyslexia Act. And then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. And we all know how that turned out, and it looked completely different for families and for educators who were teaching virtually from home, and then also sitting next to their children who were learning virtually from home. It was a lot. And I chose these for headlines because they each touch different aspects of our daily lives. Education, I'm sorry, you guys. Education, politics, business, right? So again, this is not just an issue or a challenge that we're facing in education. It really just goes across all sectors of life. So what's included in this comprehensive policy? If we're saying that we want to make sure that students are at the center and that we're going to improve student achievement, what do we need to do? We need to support teachers and administrators and support the policy. We have to ensure that our teachers are empowered with the knowledge that they need in order to make those instructional decisions in the classroom. So professional development, training in the science of reading, reading coaches to help teachers transfer the theory into practice when they go into their classrooms. Our educator preparation programs, a partnership with our higher ed to ensure that they begin to see themselves in K-12 outcomes, right? We do not work in silos. What happens in those educator preparation classrooms directly impact how our teachers show up on day one, right? So we all have to be involved in making sure that we are supportive in this process. And then of course, funding. Nothing worse than an unfunded mandate, right? So funding is needed to be able to support these efforts. Next, assessment and parent notification. Teachers who have their classrooms and show up on day one with children, they come from everywhere. Teachers are superheroes, especially when I think about my kindergarten teachers, how their children coming from home, their children coming from Head Start, their children coming from grandmama's house, they're coming from, you know, the lady down the street that keeps kids, right? And teachers have to identify where all of those children are and start from there. They have to have assessments to identify where children are to know what they need. So universal screening, screening for characteristics of dyslexia, very important. And then also notifying parents, making sure that parents are a part of the process from the beginning. And you wouldn't think that you needed that in law. There are so many instances where parents do not find out until the end of the school year. I hear some amen people. I must have brought some of y'all from the South. They do not find out until the end of the school year that their child has been struggling. So we have to make sure that our parents are our partners. And of course, instruction and intervention, thank you, Ruth. Because this is a little, yeah. Wasn't it smooth? Thanks, Emily, but wasn't it smooth? I appreciate it. Okay, so instruction and intervention, materials matter. When teachers learn this new knowledge, they can't go back to their classrooms with materials that do not align to how best to teach children how to read. Elimination of 3Qing, instructional materials, those that focus on meaning, semantics and syntax, and then also visuals for the basis of word reading, like literally asking children to not look at the word, to figure out the word. But okay, so the next would be, of course, individual reading plans, interventions, progress monitoring, just addressing the needs of students and making sure that you're keeping your finger on the pulse of where students are. And lastly, retention and intensive intervention. So Mississippi and there are other states that have a promotion retention component to their law, where students, if they, with all of the supports, the universal screening, the interventions, when they reach third grade, if they do not pass a cut score or qualify for one of the good cause exemptions, then those students are retained for an additional year. Mississippi's retention study was just released yesterday, where they followed a cohort of students, our first cohort of students who were retained 2014. They took the assessment 2014, 2015. They were retained during the 2015-2016 year, and they followed those students through 7th through 6th grade, and they compared them to those students who were in 7th grade, for those students who were just above the cut score, and it showed that our students who were retained with a different retention year, right, a year that included more intensive interventions and the supports, outperformed those students who passed, who were just above the cut score, significantly. But it also showed that there was no negative impact on, or students did not, there was not an increase in referrals for special education, nor suspensions or absences, I'm sorry, not suspensions, but absences for those students. So all of these things that we've heard before about the retention year and how it can be devastating for students, If you're retaining students just to retain students, then yes. But if you're retaining students to ensure that they get what they need prior to moving on to the next grade, where we know it's going to be more challenging, then it can work. And there will be a webinar next week where I, along with Governor Bush and Dr. Carey Wright, discuss the results of that study. So if you want to know more about that, then that will be happening next week. So what did we do in Mississippi? I was just fortunate enough to be able to lead this effort in Mississippi when the law was passed in 2013. And we had all these things, right? The things that I just had on the slide. What are the early literacy principles? We implemented each of these things. We even had a small effort, and we're continuing to this day, to ensure that our faculty at our colleges of education received training in the science of reading. We had about a cohort of 38 faculty who have gone through science of reading training, and they have a coach. So they're using the same model that we've used in K-3 to ensure, and I think that sometimes we take it for granted, that we tell our faculty, well, yes, we're going to shift coursework, and no one's taken into account that maybe they learned with the whole language approach, and that's why they're teaching it. So we have to invest in their knowledge as well. Okay. I think I have to kind of go through this. All right, so let's talk about Wisconsin's early literacy landscape. Now, anytime I begin to talk about data in a room with a state, I have to say, I always have to say that in order for us to improve, right, we have to know where we are. This is not data shaming. This is an opportunity for us to learn from where we've been, to know where we need to be. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Wisconsin's data. And I'm going to compare that data to Mississippi's and Florida's, because Mississippi and Florida have both passed third grade promotion laws. So when we think about the fundamental principles, I've told you these are the things that are needed. So ExcelinEd also released last week a website, earlyliteracymatters.org. And on this website, you can search for any state, and it will give you this overview of what the state has adopted in law or state regulation. So this is the snapshot of Wisconsin. So Wisconsin has adopted some fundamental principles. And this is not implementation. Yeah, so I have to make that disclaimer. This is not implementation, this is what's on the books. So some of you may be looking to say, oh wow, science of reading training. We have science of reading training here. I haven't been to science of reading training. No one's called me to go to science of reading training, right? So the good thing about knowing where you are currently is that so we can ensure that these things are happening everywhere. Science of reading may be happening in some places, it's not happening everywhere, right? So we can be more knowledgeable about what needs to be done and where we need to go from here. Reading struggles don't discriminate. So it doesn't matter if you're white, black, Hispanic, low income, right? Reading struggles do not discriminate. We have learned this over and over again every time NAEP comes out. But I always say that we can no longer tout how well we're doing by how well our white students are doing. Oh, well, all right. Right? So when we're talking about all kids, we mean all kids. Okay. So context for state comparisons, and I'm going to give you all an opportunity to just kind of look at these numbers. So I'll go through them, but just make sure that you're just kind of taking note. I think some of you may be taking pictures about these slides that are going to come up next. All right, so Wisconsin's scale score on NAEP for 2022 was 217, ranked at 18. You say, oh, that's okay. Well, guess what? The rest of the country didn't do well. You know, so it's nothing for any of us across this country to really be excited about, but okay. The thing about that is that Wisconsin is now tied with Mississippi for scale scores. We heard some of you say, thank God for Mississippi. We heard it. It's okay. We love you anyway. But Wisconsin's now tied with Mississippi for scale score, and for the rank, Mississippi is now 21st from 49th. From 49th to 29th to 21st. Yeah. So it wasn't overnight. We were 49th. We've been last. I think everyone knows that. As long as there was a list for education rankings, we were last. We were 29th in 2019 and 21st here. So let's talk a little bit about funding. So when we talk about per pupil, Wisconsin spends 30% more than Florida and 37% more than Mississippi per student, which shows that, yes, we need funding, but we need funding that is going to the right things, that's targeted for the right things, right? Okay, so this is where it's going to get real. So overall, all students, in 1992, someone do the math, I'm reading, that's 30 years ago, right? All right, 1992, fourth graders in Wisconsin outperformed their peers nationally by nearly a grade level. Florida by more than 1.5 grade levels, and Mississippi by 2.5 grade levels. By 2022, Wisconsin is outperformed by Florida nearly a grade level, tied with Mississippi, and barely besting the national average. All right, so I'll let that sink in. So let's move on to your low-income students. In 2022, low-income fourth graders in Wisconsin are performing worse than their 1998 peers and are now below the national public average and more than a grade level behind Mississippi and Florida. And I will say this, in 2019, Mississippi's low-income white, black, and Hispanic students outperformed their peers nationally. So it doesn't matter what your zip code is. I grew up in a low-income area, and I was invited here to talk about Mississippi. Like, all of these things are very ironic on this day, aren't they? But honestly, right? So it doesn't matter as long as children have what they need and they have teachers who are knowledgeable and all the things, right? So, average scale score for black students in Wisconsin. In 1992, black fourth graders in Wisconsin outperformed their peers nationally by nearly a grade level, and in Florida and Mississippi by more than a grade level. By 2022, they were performing nearly a grade level worse than their peers nationally and lagging Florida and Mississippi 2 grade levels. Worse, 2022, Wisconsin black fourth graders lagged their 1992 peers by more than a full grade level. And out of the 40 jurisdictions, I believe that had black student data from NAEP, I believe Wisconsin's maybe 38th or 39th. Yeah. I can go back to the first slide and see. All right, and so Hispanic students. 2022, Hispanic fourth graders in Wisconsin scored below the national public average and were performing more than a grade level worse than Mississippi and 2 grade levels worse than Florida. And white students. In 1992, your white fourth graders outperformed Mississippi and Florida by a grade level, but by 2022, Wisconsin is at the national average and bested by Florida and Mississippi. So what is it going to take? It's going to take an interconnected system from policy to practice. Legislators have the job of passing policy. The rest of us have the job of ensuring that we're making it work and that we're actually doing it and implementing it effectively. So I am going to pass this along to Dr. Mark Seidenberg, who is going to talk to you about the science of reading, how we read, why so many can't, and what can be done about it. I'm just going to have to do this.
Well, while I set up, wasn't that great? Also, it'll just take me a minute, but if someone could maybe close the curtains a little, the slides, people would be able to read the slides more easily. I think those are real curtains. Yes. Okay, thank you, and I'm really glad to be here and glad we're all here and on a bright sunshiny day. My topic is really going to be using reading research to improve literacy outcomes. So let me just start with a question. What do you need to know to be able to teach chemistry? You need to know about chemistry. What do you need to know to be able to teach history? What do you need to know to be able to teach reading? Well, you need to know about literacy. You might say you need to know how to create a literacy-rich environment. You need to bring children into literacy, which is a wonderful thing. Build interest, motivation, sense of value around reading. That's not exactly right. The relevant background is actually the cognitive science of reading, language, learning, development, and other topics. Those are the things that speak to how children learn to read and how we can ensure that they do as well as they can. This isn't part of teachers' training. It isn't part of principals' training or superintendents or heads of the Department of Public Instruction. We know that it's not part of their pre-service training, and that's now the focus of a great deal of attention. Here's another question. What do you need to know in order to create a commercial reading curriculum? It's the same answer. Do the authors of commercial curricula, which I might say are very expensive, have this expertise? They do not. This is a huge problem. Most teachers are still learning how to teach reading from the commercial materials that they're being supplied. So they're learning the Calkins approach, they're learning the Fountas and Pinnell approach, they're learning the approach that's embedded in these commercial products. These materials are defective. What teachers have traditionally learned from them, historically learned from them, is poor practices. What's the effect? Some kids are going to learn to read anyway. But for a lot of children, it makes it harder to succeed. It's very discouraging to fail. And it's especially problematic for kids who are at risk for other reasons, which could be another language spoken in the home, which means they have other things that they have to deal with. It might be because of poverty. It might be any number of other challenges, lack of resources in the community, and so on. So for kids who are at risk, and those are the ones who are showing up in these data as really not reading well, primarily, poor materials and teachers who haven't learned some of this stuff about how the relevant sort of research and science is really harmful. So there's your problem. Reading difficulties obviously arise from several causes. We are not addressing homelessness here, or lead poisoning, or any of the other factors that also affect not only children's reading, but many other things. But we are addressing something else that matters a lot: how reading is taught. It matters especially for kids who don't have access to resources in the home or community. Until very recently, and still I would say largely, it's still true, the educational establishment adheres to beliefs and practices that make it harder for teachers to teach and for children to learn. I should say, the idea here is to empower teachers and other educators to be able to do the job they want to do. It is an empowering message. It is not anti-teacher. And reforms centering around reading are often portrayed as somehow against the interests of teachers. But of course, the message here is that we want to give teachers the tools that will allow them to succeed and that will allow children to succeed. So people want to incorporate the science of reading. I'm one of the scientists who does the research, has done the research. Okay, what's this so-called science of reading? It's an enormous body of research on all aspects of reading from across the lifespan, from before kids get to school to old age. It's about behavior and the brain. It's about different languages and writing systems. It's about kids who have different language backgrounds because they are bilingual or trilingual or speak a regional dialect. It's about kids who are typical developers and kids who are atypical for one or another condition, for one or another reason. And it talks about individual differences, how children vary, and why every kid is not alike. It's relevant to everything. It's relevant to preparing teachers for the job. It's relevant to curriculum and practices, assessment. It's relevant to equity. You need to have methods and materials that work for all children, not just Dick and Jane. It's relevant to family and community engagement, and it's relevant, obviously, to the goal of achieving better outcomes. I'm not going to summarize this in 10 minutes. It's a little bit more extensive than that. But what I will do is just give you some examples of what the research is about and how it really directly relates to decisions about what to teach and how. So I'm going to have some examples drawn from research about what to do and also an example of what not to do. So some of you might have seen in December, there was an article in the New York Times. It was about helping students in high school who had not learned to read and focusing attention on giving them that relevant kinds of instruction. Clearly, older students are entitled to relevant and effective instruction. All students are. One of the problems with our educational system is we kind of give up on reading instruction in schools after about grade 4. But if the kids can't read, there's no reason to stop teaching them reading. And that's true if they're in high school. It's true if they're younger. So that program, great, and it's obviously filling a need. Clearly, it would be easier to do it right the first time. It's harder when kids are older. So that's why we have a huge emphasis on learning to read, beginning reading, early grades. The emphasis that this symposium is about. And that is indeed extremely important. We need to teach kids as effectively and efficiently and equitably as we can. But on the first day of school, there are enormous differences among children in terms of what they know, what their experiences have been, and their ability to benefit from instruction. There's a huge amount of research on this. A lot of differences are related to language, what language you speak, what dialect you speak, what range of vocabulary, what your vocabulary is like, your familiarity with various kinds of expressions. A variety of things related to language vary across children for a variety of reasons. Children also differ in terms of the things we use language to talk about. Topics, knowledge of the world, animal habitats, fruits and vegetables. So there are huge differences already between kids as a result of experiences leading up to that first day of school. And for, education is we're already trying to play catch up for kids who are behind. The last line on this slide is that what various studies show is that the differences between kids who are better prepared for reading on the beginning of school and less well prepared increase over the first 3 years of school. They don't get smaller, they get bigger. What's the implication? What does the research say to do? It's obvious. Here's a bad idea. Start teaching reading earlier. Some states are indeed pursuing this. The problem with that is it assumes the kid's problem is about print, but it's not. The problem is about the things that enable learning about print. It's about that language box, which has a lot of things in it, including knowledge of the world. Print instruction, print knowledge builds on that. They're related. So just teaching the kid, start teaching basic skills in pre-K doesn't address the fundamental problem, which is not having the foundations for learning about print. Here's a good idea. Pre-K focused on language and knowledge of the world, the things we use language to talk about. What's it mean? Well, I'm not in charge. I don't design the programs. But I imagine a program in which you simply are exposing children to a wider variety of words, expressions, and uses of language than they might otherwise be getting. Especially, you have the opportunity to expose them to quote-unquote school language, which is the language of the school, in particular, the language that's used in the books that children are supposed to be learning to read, which they are not equally familiar with. This is through usage. This is through activities. It is not through instruction about grammar. Children are great, in this age range, are fantastic at absorbing language. What you need, I imagine, a pre-K in which there are people with different accents or slightly different language backgrounds who are demonstrating to kids that people like that can communicate and how they communicate. And by the way, exposing them to things that go beyond their immediate experience, and place them in a position that's more comparable and more to others and kind of puts them on the right track. I should emphasize one thing here that's really important. It's not just listening. It's producing language. It's talking. It's getting feedback about talking, but it is actually producing the utterances. It's talk. This is really important. Mary Ellen McDonald, who's a professor in the psychology department here at UW-Madison, is well known for some classic studies that show it compared learning where sometimes either the person had to produce utterances like sentences that they needed to learn in a grammar, or they heard them. It's much better learning when you have to produce them. There's various reasons for that. It leads to a really important, so the first thing is we should be encouraging talk. I've been in a lot of classrooms where the emphasis is on control and on order, and talk is discouraged. Kids are only supposed to talk if they're asked to respond. No, the idea is to have language washing over them so that they have the opportunity to learn it. What we're doing in a lot of schools is enforcing silence, silent lunch. It's a kind of punishment that you get in some schools. Okay, so talk is very important. It leads to a hypothesis which hasn't been tested yet. It's a really good idea. It says that the fastest way to improve children's beginning reading is talking to them. It's working on their spoken language, having them produce utterances of increasing complexity. Okay, here's another what to do coming out of research. Research says, so incorporate basic findings about how people learn. This is something that's not come into the science of reading approach yet, but it will eventually, and we need to move it along. How do people learn? It's ironic. The thing that's actually missing here is more about how do people learn? So here's some examples. So you heard about the simple view of reading. The simple view of reading says something really important and true. It says that it gives you the most straightforward rationale for why people have to teach kids about print and why the goal is to relate print to the language they already know. Crucial. The question is, okay, how? Similarly, the National Reading Panel report from 20 years ago pointed out these areas, pillars of reading instruction. People here are familiar with them, I'm sure. Those are goals. The question is how to get there. And that's what we really need to focus on now. This is like having a recipe, for example, for how to bake a cake, where you've got the ingredients, and everybody goes, yeah, those are great ingredients. Now what are the steps for combining them so that you get the cake at the end? That's where we're weak. That's where there's a lot of research to draw on, and that's where the future is going to be for the science of reading. Pictures like this kind of give you a false sense of rigor, I think. It just leaves open too many different ways of going from a picture like this to effective practices. What the research does for us here is it says, what's the balance between different kinds of experiences that will allow children to get this kind of knowledge in a way that is efficient and effective and equitable? If I have a few minutes, I'll just talk about, well, what do we know about learning? There's two major forms of human learning. One of them is people learn from explicit instruction. It's language. It requires attention. It's relatively slow. It's talking, it's explaining. It's instruction, traditional instruction. The other kind of learning people do is what you are all doing right now. So brains engage in what's called statistical learning. It's unconscious, it's automatic, you don't turn it on and off. It's something that's happening all the time. It allows you to identify who's in the room and the fact that the room is three-dimensional. It allows you to update your knowledge of language and other things as you are listening, talking, thinking. People are updating this information in the background all the time. So the idea is to get a balance between these two forms of learning. Right now, we're a little too focused on the explicit instruction part. So a lot of what's happening is people have discovered we need to teach kids certain kinds of things in order to promote reading, and we're giving short shrift to this other very powerful kind of learning. So the balance is really out of whack. We've got a lot of teaching going on of very many things. It's unnecessary and it's inefficient. What we want to do is enough teaching to be able to enable this other process that will allow children to go far further without close supervision. So here's an example of how that works. Vocabulary. How many words do you know? Depends on how you define word. You know somewhere between 20 and 40,000 words. How many of them were you explicitly taught? Tiny fraction. Tiny fraction. Teaching some of them is important at a particular point in a child's development, but you're not teaching them all. There's far too much to learn, too little time, and there's other things that have to be accomplished as well. How did you learn all those other words? We understand this. There's quite a lot of research that really nails it pretty well. Basically, you're doing it the way AI programs are doing it. You're learning about patterns over a lot of examples. So I can't go into any details, but if you know the words lion and tiger, then the properties of how lion and tiger are used in utterances show regularities. They exhibit patterns. Words with similar meanings tend to appear in similar contexts. What does that allow you to do? If you get a word like lynx, you're going to be able to infer something about what it means because it appears in contexts like line and tiger. Most of what you're learning is, in fact, done via these indirect, implicit sorts of methods. It's not through explicit instruction. So the bottom line is, yes, readers do require instruction about print. How much? Enough to enable to turn learning over to the kid so that they can actually make use of this much more powerful implicit mechanism. We want the beginning reader to achieve escape velocity. Get them to the point where more and more of the learning is in something that they can accomplish through reading and other activities. Research speaks to the balance between these two. I have to repeat, they're both important. The science of reading, though, is focused on one, and we need to bring it more in alignment, bring the two into more alignment. Okay, so that was two examples of things where research is not just abstract, it's not just laboratory stuff that isn't relevant to what decisions are made about how to teach kids and what to do when. It actually is highly relevant to classroom. Here's an example of research to determine what not to do. Look, there isn't research that addresses every problem, every issue, every question. You know, sometimes I think educators think that we're going to have research which says what to do exactly each day in a classroom, in every classroom, regardless of how many kids there are and who the kids are and what the teacher is and where they are in the world. The research isn't really like that. Research tells us things about general principles that are absolutely true, that if incorporated will improve practices. Even if we can't say, we don't have a study that tells us exactly, even if there are limits on the kinds of studies we can do just for practical reasons, it's also important to use research to weed out the bad practices, and we can do that. So the example people use is 3 queuing systems, which you heard about. It's a guessing approach. It's not right. It's this common idea. It was very persuasive. It sounded sort of logical. There were some authorities who said it was the right thing to do. It wasn't connecting to research which actually addressed questions like, well, how predictable are the words that occur in children's books? And what happens if a child guesses a word from the context and makes an error? Do they learn from making the error? Yes, they do. Is it a really good idea to have the kid try to figure out the meaning of a word in the context? Why don't we just give them the tools to do so? Like, understand that this spelling corresponds to this word with this pronunciation and meaning. So we knew that this approach was a bad idea. The research says why it is a bad idea, and it says what to do instead. It has taken a lot of time for that to get absorbed into the system. It's beginning to be absorbed. I offhandedly said this thing, the best cue to a word is the word itself, not all this stuff about the context. So you can buy it on a t-shirt as well. So that's an example in which research is telling us something that is very easily related to actual practices and also points to what to do instead. We knew this a long time ago. Marilyn Adams discussed this in her 1990 book. It was dead in the water then. That predates Fountas and Pinnell, Calkins, etc. So people were incorporating this mistaken idea into the materials that were being used to teach kids across the country, and in some cases still are, even though it had really been dissected a long time ago. I took it up again in my book. It is getting much more broader recognition now, but we need to do more than just pounce on 3 queuing. There's so much more that we could make use of. Okay, so my time's almost up. We know a lot more. I'm just going to try to give you a flavor of it. So my idea is that the research is really complex. There's a lot of it. And what we need to do is compile it into a form that gives you reliable information, but liberates people from having to be cognitive science PhDs. So what are the things that we can safely say based on research that might be useful? Here's one, eyes on the prize. The goal of reading instruction is reading. So we see a lot of focus on components of reading. And that is justified only to the extent that it is advancing the actual goal, reading, understanding texts of increasing complexity for a variety of purposes. One sees things going on in classrooms where there's so much emphasis on the components, there isn't time left over for reading. Everything's related to everything else. Use it. So what does reading involve? Well, basically it involves, you've got to have the knowledge of print, knowledge of language, and knowledge of the things we use language to talk about. That's like knowledge of the world. These aren't independent. They're obviously related. Print is a code for representing spoken language. Spoken language is a way that we talk about things in the world. When you learn about things about the world, it changes your language. When you learn about spoken language, it influences how you learn about print, etc. These things are interrelated, and instruction that takes advantage of that can move ahead much more rapidly. In the cognitive science world, there's something called bootstrapping, where you get a little knowledge of one that kind of gives you a hint about something else, and then you build up your knowledge about that something else, and it gives you further information about. You go back and forth trying to bootstrap these different kinds of knowledge, and it works because they're related. Currently, people's understanding of learning is like, it's one brick at a time. So you introduce the parts of reading in a logical order. Look, we're off to a good start, but we can do better. Learning isn't really like this stair step. Kids are learning more than one thing at a time because all these properties of language are correlated with one another. When you teach a kid about the meaning about a word, you might be also teaching them about its pronunciation, how it's spelled. When you're teaching kids about phonemes, hopefully you're linking it to the letters that represent them. When you're teaching them about syllables, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you are learning about one of these things, you are also learning about others. If you have instructional practices that say, well, first we start with the first building block, like phonemes. A bad idea in my, according to this, it's not something that's supported by research. But say you start out with learn the phonemes, then learn the letters, then learn how the letters and phonemes correspond. Sounds like a logical progression. It's breaking things apart in a really unnatural way, and it's foregoing the opportunity to learn how those things fit together and have one of them help the other. Okay, here's another principle. Boundaries, people. So what teachers need to know is different from what children need to know. And that, I don't think, is really being respected right now. I think there's a great deal of excitement among teachers about many teachers, who are, after all, learners. They are devoted to learning. There's a lot of excitement when you discover this stuff that you weren't taught. It's so much fun. I mean, morphology, it's a crazy system, but it's so much fun. The way in which the stress patterns for English, why are words like have and give and why do words have irregular pronunciations? Well, it turns out there are historical reasons for them, and there's various kinds of patterns and so on. There's so much, it's something I devoted my life to. Language is great. And I'm really good at Wordle, too. But look, what teachers need to know, just because you can teach it doesn't mean you should teach it. Your time is limited. We need to get in, get out, and move on. The idea is to do these things in a way that allows the kid to move ahead on the reading part. It's not to get swamped with the components and the parts. So what I see is people apparently teaching lots of stuff that's really not necessary, and it's opportunity costs here. You're learning the opportunity, losing the opportunity to spend it on things that are more effective. How do I know this? Because I am on TikTok. So here's one. Maybe it'll play. I don't know.
So here's a pattern to help you know when ED is going to make which of its three sounds. If a word ends with a D or a T, the ED ending is going to sound like id. If a word ends with a voice sound, which means you use your voice box to say that sound, that ED ending is going to sound like d. And if a word ends with an unvoiced sound, which means you don't use your voice box, that ending is going to sound like t.
Okay, probably didn't understand that, but that's how you produce the past tense in English. You don't need to know that rule. You learned it from spoken language. The only place in which it would even be vaguely relevant is if you're speaking a dialect in which the verb morphology doesn't work this way. And in that case, you need to compare, the morphology that the child might have, done, gone, or something like that, with the morphology of the other language, but of the other dialect. But the idea that it's true, what she just said, it's a fact about phonology that it's also true of how we form the plural, by the way. But there's absolutely no reason for any kid to ever be taught that. And yet we see, people are really thinking, oh, we can teach this. Okay. I have one final thought, which is, there's a lot of other, this list goes on for quite a while. Another one is, we need equitable instructional practices and materials. So I've been studying major curricula, how they deal with sight words, phonics, various other things. They all do things differently, which is appalling. Because they can't all be equally good. A lot of the lessons don't land equally well with all kids. They make assumptions about the backgrounds of the kids that aren't valid. It might be that you're teaching them a phonics lesson and assuming a pronunciation of word of a word that's not the way that kid pronounces it. So it might be that there are stories that the kid is learning to read that are situated in situations that kids are not familiar with. One of the places this shows up is in word problems, math word problems. So math word problems are a really funny genre, and it's appalling how many of them are antiquated and based on very somewhat obscure knowledge. So we studied them, and there are ones about things like playing cards, going to a gym, going to work out. This is for 3rd and 7th graders, They are assuming things that are not general knowledge, and of course they are advantaging people who are familiar with them and not disadvantaging the people who aren't. It has nothing to do with math. Okay, so many people, I think, are really aware of this, but action is really needed. We need to have materials that work for children who have different backgrounds and come in with different kinds of things to build on. And we are not at that point yet. And it would be really unfortunate if we stopped where we are now, knowing that we could go so much further. Okay, we've got enormous opportunity here, got a good start. Science is highly relevant. We need to get more of it into the pipeline. Otherwise, we're going to be selling a news story. And that will undermine the goals that we all share. Thank you. I will now turn it over to the astonishing Emily Henry.
I think you might still be plugged in. Are you still plugged in? Yeah. Am I plugged in and ready to go? Yep. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Now it's afternoon. Right. So, okay. Thank you, Mark. So everything that Mark just talked about, I knew nothing about that or hadn't really thought much about any of that several years ago. Even though I was already an education reporter, I've actually been an education reporter for a long time, since 2008. And I really probably should have known more about reading and cognitive science and how people learn and how kids learn to read in particular, but I didn't. And when it comes to reading, I think one of the reasons why I didn't know very much about it, it's not really an excuse, but it has to do with the fact that reading came pretty easily to me, I think, when I was a little kid. I don't really remember very much about learning how to read. One of the things, I don't think many of us do, but I do know that people who struggled tend to remember more. It is an experience that sometimes is imprinted in their brain early because it was a very traumatic experience for a lot of people. But reading wasn't very hard for me. And then I had 2 kids, and they learned to read pretty easily too. And I think that I assumed that reading just kind of happens. That if you read enough books to kids, if they want to read, if they're in a literate environment, they become readers. And then I started meeting parents whose kids did not learn to read easily. So this was back in 2016, 2017. And I made an audio documentary about this called Hard to Read. So it's specifically about kids with dyslexia, which I knew nothing about as well. But I was hearing the same story from parents all over the country over and over again. And here's how the story goes. Our child started school, and we were thinking something wasn't really quite right here. We went to the teacher, and the teacher said, don't worry, just make sure you read lots of books to him, everything's gonna be fine. And it kind of went on and on like this, where the parents were saying, I think something's wrong here. The school was saying, don't worry about it. It's gonna all work out. It's gonna come together in time. You gotta find your kid the right book. And what eventually happens, if the family has time, and especially if the family has money, and this gets to equity, is that the family pays for private testing. And this testing usually costs thousands of dollars. And then the family might also pay for private tutoring, which also costs thousands of dollars. And the parents with the struggling reader might end up hiring an attorney or an educational consultant or both to help them fight for what their child needs in school. And all of this is really, really expensive. It's also incredibly frustrating, exhausting, really, really, really hard. And the parents begin to realize that their little kid maybe is not going to get what he needs in school. Or, and this is really important, he's not going to get it fast enough. Because now this kid is like 8 or 9 or 10 years old, and he really doesn't like school. And he's falling behind in other subjects because he can't read very well. And maybe he's beginning to act out in school, or maybe this is all manifesting as like withdrawal, anxiety, depression. This is when, if the family has the resources, they might pull their kid out of public school altogether. Maybe they homeschool their child, or maybe they come up with a way to get the tens of thousands of dollars that it can cost to send the child to a specialized private school, if there is a private school nearby, and if they can get in. That's a big if in lots of parts of this country. So here's the situation that I think that we're in. If you can come up with the money to pay for it, you can probably find a way for your struggling reader to be taught how to read. But if you don't have the money and your child is not learning to read in school, what do you do about that? What do you do? So the equity implications of this really are stunning. If you're from a low-income family or even a moderate-income family, there's no safety net here. There's no backup if you're not being taught how to read in school. As one mom put it to me many years ago, getting help for a struggling reader is a rich man's game. So we are talking about reading, which is really the most basic and fundamental skill. It's this foundational academic skill that so much of school learning is based on. And that is a rich man's game. So how did that happen? And how is it allowed to continue? So this led me to this next reporting project, which was called Hard Words, which was mentioned earlier. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry, I was one slide ahead. That was the slide for what I was talking about before. This is the slide for what I'm talking about now. So Hard Words is an audio documentary and article about core reading instruction. So not what needs to be done for kids who are really struggling in particular, but rather, what do all children need to learn to become good readers? And this is when I read Mark's book, Language at the Speed of Sight, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend that you read it. I think it was 2017. So his book was a complete revelation to me. It upended all the assumptions that I didn't really know that I had about how kids learn to read. And here's something that Mark writes in the book. Reading to children rarely involves teaching them to read. The activity contributes to the child's progress, as he was just talking about, big time. The activity of reading aloud to a child, it contributes to the child's progress, but it's not all that's required. Some children do learn to read with minimal instruction, but unlike learning to talk, it is a mistake to assume that they will. Children who are read to until the cow jumps over the moon can still have difficulty becoming readers. And it's not, yeah, you can applaud for that. It's not just kids with dyslexia, right? So what kids with dyslexia need to learn to become good readers is not substantially different from what all kids need to learn to become good readers. Kids with dyslexia might need a more intense dose of a certain kind of instruction, but all kids can benefit from the kinds of instruction that kids with dyslexia desperately need. And lots of kids have a hard time learning how to read. It's actually pretty hard for plenty of kids. It doesn't have to do with intelligence. Like, plenty of very smart people have difficulty learning how to read. They can learn how to read, but they need to be taught how to do it. They need to be given a good start. So this, oh, there we go. I'm a little, oh, look at that. Okay, calm down. Okay. This illustration compiles estimates from a number of studies. Probably some of you have seen this. Many of you have probably seen it. It was made by a woman named Nancy Young. And you can find the citations for where she gets her estimates on her website. I like sources. So this illustration shows that roughly, this is an approximate, about 40% of kids are going to learn to read pretty well, no matter how you teach them. Most kids are going to need some instruction, but a little bit of instruction and immersion in a literate environment with all the things that Mark was talking about is probably going to do the job, right? But more than half of kids, maybe about 60% of them, are not going to learn to read well unless they're explicitly taught some things about how their written language works. And even those kids who may not need much explicit instruction can become better readers and particularly better spellers if they're taught how to read and spell. But kids were not getting the instruction that they need in many schools, still aren't today. And that's where my reporting went next. I wanted to know, how are kids being taught to read in school? So I made this next documentary in 2019, so we're sort of marching through time here. It was called At a Loss for Words, and it is an audio documentary and an article, and it is focused on this particular theory about how skilled reading works and how kids learn to do it, a theory that it turns out isn't right. But you will find evidence of this theory, sort of remnants of it, in curriculum materials and teacher training in schools today. So we're talking about stuff that has already been brought up a couple of times today. So this theory was originally proposed here in the United States back in the 1960s by a professor named Ken Goodman. He wasn't the only one, but he asserted this in a 1967 paper and went on to become considered one of the sort of fathers of the whole language movement here in the US. And the idea behind whole language was basically the idea that I had in my mind before I started doing this reporting, before I read Mark's book. The basic idea that reading just kind of happens with maybe a little bit of instruction if kids are in a literate environment. So Goodman had a theory about reading that justified this whole language approach, and this theory came to be known as cueing, or 3-cueing, which is the way that Goodman talked about it. So this is a diagram. He laid out this theory in this 1967 paper with the title, Reading, a Psycholinguistic Guessing Game. So in this paper, Ken Goodman rejects the idea that reading is a precise process that involves exact or detailed perception of letters or words. Instead, he argued that as people read, they make predictions about words on the page using these different cues. So the graphic cues, so the letters are one clue. What do the letters tell you about what the word is, what it might be? syntactic cues, like what kind of word could it be? For example, is this a noun or a verb? And then the semantic cues, like what word would make sense here based on the context. So in his paper, Goodman concluded this. He wrote, skill in reading involves not greater precision, but more accurate first guesses based on better sampling techniques, greater control over language structure, broadened experiences, and increased conceptual development. As the child develops reading skill and speed, he uses increasingly fewer graphic cues. So he relies less and less on the letters. And a sort of version of this theory, not exactly the same, but quite similar, about how reading works was also proposed by a woman on the other side of the world at about the same time. They didn't know each other at first. This woman's name was Mari Clay. She was a teacher and a developmental psychologist in New Zealand, and she developed a reading intervention program for struggling first graders called Reading Recovery. And one of the big ideas that followed from this theory, this cueing theory of how reading works, is that kids don't need to be taught how to sound out written words, because the letters in the words are just one cue or clue for knowing what the word is. But there are these other ways to figure out the words. There are these other cues. So this theory really ended up justifying the idea that kids don't need any phonics instruction. And the whole language movement took off in the 1970s and 80s, and a lot of kids didn't get phonics instruction or much of it. They weren't taught how to sound out the written words. And it became pretty clear by the 90s that that had been a big mistake. The research was really clear, as was just mentioned by then, about the importance not only of some phonics instruction in the early stages of learning how to read. There were big reports that included that finding. There was a huge government effort in the early 2000s called Reading First, and the goal was to get this scientific research about reading into schools to help teachers understand how important it is to teach children something about how their written language works, that it's not the same as learning how to talk. And whole language was really discredited by these big reports and this stuff that was going on by the early 2000s. It became clear to a lot of people, not all, but even many people who had believed in the whole language theory, either said they did or sort of ascribed to that theory about reading, they acknowledged that kids need some phonics instruction. So they started to add that back in. A lot of schools, not all, but many schools started adding some phonics instruction. But here's the really important point. That cueing idea didn't go away. In other words, the idea that beginning readers should be taught lots of different strategies to help them figure out the written words, to help them identify the words, that continued. And so you see strategies like this. So this was actually sent home in a child's backpack just a few years ago. His mom sent it to me. These are all strategies for kids to use when they're reading and they come to a word they don't know. And these strategies really seem sensible. They like make sense. You get to a word you don't know, what can you do? So you can look at the picture to try to figure out what the word might be. You don't want to completely guess, so you maybe look at the first letter. Looking at some of the letters will narrow your choices. It'll help you come up with a good guess. And then you can check to see if you were right. You can reread the sentence using the word and see if the sentence makes sense. And if you're stuck, you can just skip the word and move on, and hopefully you can get the basic gist of the sentence anyway. You probably can, especially in an easy book. So here's another way the cueing strategies are taught to kids. I'm sure you've seen these. These are word reading strategies that are everywhere. They're on posters in classrooms. They're on bookmarks that are sent home with kids. They're on Pinterest, on Teachers Pay Teachers. Maybe they're on TikTok, I don't know. My friend's 15-year-old daughter has sent me a few interesting TikTok videos about all of this. These are all ways that kids can try to figure out the words without having to laboriously sound them out. And sounding out written words in English is actually kind of challenging. I think that's one reason these word reading strategies became so popular. Many teachers were not taught what they needed to know about written English to be able to teach it well to little kids. They weren't taught that in college. They weren't being taught that in professional development on the job. I interviewed an elementary school principal in Pennsylvania who taught these strategies when she was a teacher, and she said, when I got into the classroom and someone told me to use this practice, I didn't question it. In fact, she said these strategies solved a problem for her. She didn't know how to teach kids how to read the words. She was never taught how to do it, but these strategies, she could use those, and they seemed sensible. What she's discovered over the last few years, though, and what a lot of teachers and principals and other educators and other people are discovering, is that these strategies are a problem. Because the cueing theory about reading isn't right. It's not how skilled reading works. So cognitive scientists showed this back in the 70s and 80s, and Marilyn Adam had a piece in the early 90s in her book. Skilled readers do not use cues and context to identify the written words as they're reading. In fact, what scientists have really shown quite compellingly is that, in fact, this is how struggling readers do it. This is how poor readers read. They tend to have a hard time with word identification. Too many of the words that they come across are like these little mysteries, series of letters that they don't know and can't quite figure out. So they use a bunch of other strategies to try to figure out what the words say. When they come across a word they don't know, they look at the first few letters and they try to think of a word that makes sense. In other words, they use context to try to come up with a word that fits. And when they cannot figure out what a word is using context clues, they skip the word, and often they can get the gist of what they're reading this way. But using context, guessing, skipping words, that is not what reading is like when you are a skilled reader. What cognitive scientists have figured out is that this is a key difference between skilled readers and unskilled readers, between experts and beginners, is that skilled readers can immediately and accurately recognize words. As Mark said, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 words. They don't need to guess or predict or use context. Skilled readers, it turns out, know tens of thousands of words in a split second. They sort of know what they are on sight. And they know those words instantly because at some point they did successfully sound out the word. And they linked the spelling of the word in their mind with the meaning and pronunciation of that word. And so by about second grade, a typically developing reader who has some good basic phonics skills, some good understanding of written English and how it works, usually just needs a few exposures to a word through its pronunciation, its spelling, and its meaning, all of those things. And bam, the word gets mapped into her memory. And the more words that a reader kind of gets into their memory this way, the more they can focus on the meaning of what they're reading, because they're not using their brain power to identify the words. They're using their brain power to understand what they're reading. And that's the goal, as Mark talked about, right? We all agree that that's the goal, for readers to understand what they're reading. The question really is, how does a little kid get there? They've got to get good at reading the words. And those word reading strategies that I told you about are actually getting in the way for some kids, as Mark said. So I'm a journalist and a storyteller, so I'm going to explain this with story. So these are first graders. Whoops. Oh, I am bad at this. Okay. These are first graders in Oakland, California, who are actually now in middle school, but here they are as cute little 6-year-olds. And a literacy coach who worked with these girls came to understand that teaching those word reading strategies were actually making it harder for many of her students to learn how to read. The coach's name is Margaret Goldberg, and she was hired by the Oakland School District in 2015 to teach leveled literacy intervention. So LLI is a reading intervention program that was developed by Irene Fountas and Gesu Pinnell. You heard their names earlier. LLI does include some phonics instruction because remember, one of the cues for figuring out a word is to use the letters. But Fountas and Pinnell's programs are rooted deeply in the work of Marie Clay, the New Zealand woman who created the Reading Recovery Program. Their programs are rooted in the idea that letters are one way to figure out a word. So in LLI, kids are also taught that when they come to a word they don't know, they can use the pictures and the context to try to come up with the word. So Margaret Goldberg started teaching Fountas and Pinnell's LLI program. That's what she was supposed to be doing. And around the same time, she found a bunch of unopened materials sitting on a shelf in her school. There are lots of unopened materials sitting on shelves in schools all over the country, gathering dust. Some of them are good and some of them are not. And anyway, but this would happen to be a systematic phonics and phonemic awareness program that teaches kids that when they come to a word they don't know, they sound it out. And it doesn't include the cueing stuff. And this phonics and phonemic awareness program in this phonics and phonemic awareness program. Beginning readers, very beginning reading, they practice reading in these decodable books that contain words with spelling patterns they've been taught, so they don't have to try to figure out the words with pictures and context. They don't have to guess, because they've been taught something about how to read the words. So Margaret started teaching some of her groups of students LLI with the cueing strategies, and some of her groups she taught this phonics and phonemic awareness program that didn't include cueing. And she started to notice differences between these two groups of kids, not just in how well they were reading the words, but in the way they approached their reading. So she and a colleague recorded these first graders talking about what makes them good readers. So I'm going to play this video for you. Mia is the little girl in the white shirt. She was learning that phonics program with none of the cueing stuff, and Jabria in the pink jacket was taught the cueing system. Oh. Uh-oh.
Yes, what makes you good readers?
I learn a lot. Because I look at the pictures and I read it.
Ooh. Do you remember when you were little and you didn't know how to read?
Yes.
Like when you started
Kinda.
kindergarten?
Yeah.
What helped you learn how to read? How did you learn?
By looking at the pictures.
Anything else?
Looking at the words and sounding them out.
So Margaret Goldberg was seeing this over and over again in her two groups of students. One group of kids was taking away from their reading instruction that reading is about looking closely at words and sounding them out. And then the other group of kids was learning that when you come to a word you don't know, you don't have to look carefully at the word and try to connect the spelling with the pronunciation and the meaning. Instead, you can actually look away from the word. You can look at the picture, you can look at the other words in the sentence. Basically, you search around for clues to help you identify the word. So here's what Margaret Goldberg, the literacy coach, said to me about the kids in her LLI groups. She said, I did lasting damage to these kids. It was so hard to ever get them to stop looking at a picture to guess what a word would be. It was so hard to ever get them to slow down and sound a word out because they had had this experience of knowing that you predict what you read before you read it. As Margaret was noticing the differences between these two groups of kids, she was discovering the scientific research on reading. It was not stuff she knew or had been taught, and she was frankly pretty shocked by what she was learning and how different it was from what the curriculum materials were telling her about how reading works. Mark mentioned that. Many teachers are learning something about reading and how it works from the materials they have. But what Margaret was learning from the curriculum materials about reading and how it works is what lots of teachers were learning and still are about how reading works, because instructional approaches that include this cueing idea are all over American classrooms. So Sold a Story is a 6-part podcast about how this happened. It's about how the cueing theory took hold and how it's hung on despite the fact that the theory is wrong. So this is a problem that clearly needs to be fixed. It will take many people to fix it. Teachers, principals, superintendents, colleges of education, legislators, policymakers, all of us, all of you, all of us have a role to play here, I would say. And I would urge all of you who care about this topic, if you care about doing something to promote positive change, to learn more not only about the science of reading, but about the science of learning, as Mark just talked about. Read Mark's book. Read any number of books and articles that have been written about this topic. There really is a lot of good stuff out there right now. So I put together a reading list about some of the books and articles that have taught me a lot about this. This list could be so much longer. You can find this reading list on the podcast website, soldastory.org. I'll also just let you know that there is a discussion guide there that you and your colleagues can use to talk about issues brought up in the podcast. I worked on it with Margaret Goldberg. Actually, Margaret Goldberg actually really wrote it, and then I just helped, did some editing. And there are also questions for parents in particular, and some questions for kids too. one of the things that's been great is that I've been hearing from a lot of children who've been listening to this work and recognizing how they're taught and troubles that they've had, and they're responding. So I'm going to end here, and this is me, actually. This is when I was in first grade. It's my first grade class picture. I know, it's yeah. I know. So I don't know, this is 1976. And you know what, two reasons why I decided to show you this photo. So number one, 1976, when I was 6, that's when cognitive scientists were doing some of the first experiments showing that this cueing theory wasn't right. 1976, so a long time ago. Here's the other thing, when I look at that picture of myself now, I am struck by something that I didn't think about at all until I started doing all this reporting on reading. The school had us pose in front of a shelf of books. This was in the school library. I remember the school library because I loved the library. And they sat us there, and our hands are on an open book. And think about how awful that might have been for a kid who couldn't read and who knew that they were supposed to be reading, because kids know when they're not reading. And think about how haunting it might be to look at it now and to be thinking, I was supposed to be learning how to read, but I wasn't. So thank you for listening. I think there's a huge amount to talk about here today, so I want to leave a lot of time for the Q&A in terms of what is happening now, as many schools and districts and entire states are making changes to reading instruction. I think Mark is very right for a note of caution. Let's make sure we're not sold another story here, right? So there are many things to discuss about the how of all of this. It's really complicated work, and it's many well-intentioned people are going to do things that maybe turn out to not be as effective, efficient, or maybe even harmful. Okay, so we have to make sure that we don't do that again. So I'm interested in hearing more from Mark, and I wrote down some questions I have, who knows the scientific research better than any of us in this room, about what's going on and whether, where we're headed in the right direction. One of the things I think is, obviously I've spent a lot of time over the past few years just sort of going at this one idea, this cueing idea, to try to show it to people and lift it up and make people aware of how harmful it is, and that's just one little piece of it. And I do feel a little bit like it sort of blew something up, and now lots of people are in a situation of having to put it all back together again, and that is not easy to do. I'm interested in hearing from Kymyona. She is one of the best experts on policy, on what is going on all over the country and how to make change. She knows how to make systems change. That is really, really important. So I'm looking forward to all your questions. Thank you so much for having me. Are we coming up here? Okay. Got some water?
Thank you. Emily takes such good care of me, y'all.
I was a waitress for, were we talking about this? Yeah. I was a waitress for many years.
Yeah. So give us about, I think the first 10 minutes or so, we're going to have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So one thing that I've learned about moderating, especially Emily, is that I'm going to end up being an interviewee and not the interviewer, because I was tasked with moderating, and I heard her say, I have all these questions. So you just have to go with the flow. All right, so the first one that I have is, as we think about the science of reading, where we are as a country, what we know more about how kids learn to read, assessments and materials that assist us in identifying and addressing reading difficulties, do you still think that there is a lack of knowledge, or is there a lack of will to change? And so basically, why aren't kids being taught to read? See what I did there? Why aren't kids being taught to read? Yeah. So what do you guys think about that?
Well,
Lack of knowledge, lack of will.
I think it's both or either. Sometimes one, I don't know. What do you think, Mark?
You're asking why aren't we just doing the right things already?
Yeah, do you think that it's still
I think it's a lot of
knowledge or lack
there's
of
a lot of we know plenty. We've known plenty for a long time. So it's not that there's a lack of knowledge or a lack of things we could be doing. And I am trying to convey excitement about the prospect of incorporating more of what we know. But
Who's the we?
well, everyone who has a stake in literacy and making sure that kids get to where they can go. Look, education, it's a very hard thing to change. There's a lot of stakeholders. There are many parties that aren't represented among us. There's historically been resistance to change for a variety of reasons. Change is often characterized as, hey, I've been in Wisconsin 22 years. I've been in the Capitol a lot of times. And there is resistance to change from a variety of quarters. So getting all of the relevant folks to pull together on something as important as this has turned out to be very, very difficult. It's not only true in Wisconsin, it's true in other places as well. So it's a lack of shared knowledge, I would say.
I think so too, because I mean, in terms of will, I don't think there's any ill will really out there. It's just there remains disagreement on what needs to change and why among people, and I think that there are more and more people getting a better understanding of why something needs to change and what are some of the things that need to change. But how to do that, you know, what are the different pieces that need to change and who changes them and how do they change and how do they get funded, and that's all really tricky. And you know, I think Mark is pointing to stuff that everyone in this room really needs to like listen to and reflect on, which is our very good intentions can still lead us astray. Good intentions lead us astray all the time. And I think, you know, many things that he said are really important to like write down, but one of them includes just this idea of what the teachers need to know versus what the kids need to know. And I really think that he's pinpointed something that is going on out there, is that many teachers are very enthusiastic about what they're learning. Like this is, for a lot of them, this is like overwhelming, but interesting and fascinating, and they're digging in and they're doing their best. But they, you know, they're flying the plane while they're building it, or building the plane while they're flying it. What is it?
Yeah.
Building the plane while they're flying it.
Both of them.
Both. They're doing both. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah.
All right, so over this last year especially, I've had several conversations with you and you were saying, well, I'm working on something. But we didn't know that it would be this, that it would be sold a story. So why take on curriculum? Why was this the right time?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I already had. I mean, I had already gotten to some of these questions in earlier documentaries. And like I said, I think I was really just looking for an answer to why. And you know, I think what journalists like to do is what we're good at, many of us, is like exposing problems and not necessarily fixing problems, or even it's even tricky figuring out how to cover the solutions to problems, because out in the messy world, sort of how you're going to make the determination of what's a solution, where is it working, what's working. That's what's so fascinating and complex about education, is this is just, you know, cause and effect is really hard to figure out. There's so many factors to take into account. But your question was, why sold a story? You know, there were a few things that I was really hoping that the podcast would accomplish. And one of them was that one of the reasons we made like a 6-part podcast, well, partly because we felt like we had a lot to say. We had a timeline that started in the 1600s and has like 2,000 entries. So I'll just say that. And then I really wanted people, what I can see is that interested parties have been getting more interested in this over the years. The parents of struggling readers have been in on this for a while, and they've been kind of bearing the burden alone in some ways. And then, more legislators and educators, people who need to know this are starting to know it. I kind of wanted, I feel like everyone needs to know this. I wanted to hear from the moms of kids who are not struggling to read, who are like, I want to do something about this in my kid's school. My kid's fine, but I want to change this for other kids. And I am hearing from those people. So that's good.
That's great. All right, so before we open it up, Mark, I need you to just settle something for us. With all the language that we're working with policymakers on and their staffers, evidence-based, research-based, just go for it. Just what's the difference?
Natural food. These aren't technical terms that mean anything to scientists. I mean, you can stretch them any way that you want. And the way that it enters into the laws and regulations that are being passed in various states, maybe, here's an example of what, it's challenging, folks. It's challenging. The bar can be set very low so that everyone can say that they're, I said this, I think in the book, everyone's going to say that their materials are evidence-based. And the bar can be set relatively low so that you can get over that. For example, so one of the things that really got people's attention, the attention of the writers of the curricula, defective curricula, was the possibility that they wouldn't be able to sell their books in particular states. That got their attention in a way that research did not.
Right.
So,
right.
So in a sense, passing laws in various states, not Wisconsin, that would regulate which curricula to use and prevent certain ones from being adopted was something that would cause change. And in fact, I don't know what Fountas and Pinnell are going to do, but certainly Calkins is trying to modify the curriculum in order to be able to continue selling her books. The question is, and she'll probably succeed because the bar is low. So there are comprehensive curricula sold by companies like McGraw-Hill that are tell the kindergarten, first grade, second grade teacher how to teach reading. They come with teacher's manuals that are literally a stack of books. And what they've done is they've included every possible approach in these materials. And it's then up to the teacher to figure out of this big thing, what are they going to do? Those materials can include phonics. I think phonics is the code word for a lot of things.
Yes.
Not just, it's a lot of basic skills related to reading words. But they will have that material in them. And so they will be aligned with the science of reading in some state. However, they also incorporate all the other approaches, and there's nothing, the teacher is left to figure it out. So I think we need better materials. I think we need better teacher training. I think we need a lot of things. I hope what I'm saying doesn't come across as negative so much as a bit frustrated, because there is a lot we can do. And unfortunately, we're in the kind of transition, right? We're it's a trajectory, folks, and we're going in the right direction, but we can't just stop. And that means continuing to improve in-service training, continuing to work on the schools of education to change how teachers are taught. It includes developing new materials that are not just bolting on some phonics, but actually incorporating things that we know about learning and reading and making it easier for teachers to do the things that are effective.
So in 2021, Arkansas passed a law that banned 3 cueing materials. They passed their law, which also includes a financial penalty if schools continue to use curricula that include 3 cueing. Charter schools can use their authorization, all of those things. Last year in 2022, Louisiana became the second state to ban 3 cueing instruction materials. We are now working with, when I say we, ExcelinEd is now working with about 7 states who are considering this type of policy. So what we found as I began looking at the language in some of these states around curriculum is that you're exactly right. The language says what should be included. It includes all the things about the science of reading, but it doesn't say what should not be included, which was the loophole that a lot of vendors needed to be able to say, well, yeah, I have all of that, but yeah, I also have this, right? So we do have model policy for prohibiting 3Qing materials. We have a lot of resources on the site. I'll talk to you guys about that in the second segment, but right now I want to open it up for Q&A. And again, we'll have another Q&A at the end. Yes.
Thank you very much to the Tommy Thompson Center. My name is Senator John Jagler. I am the chair of the Senate Education Committee. Emily, as a recovering broadcast journalist, I want to thank you and give you kudos to the podcast. It's very well done. Parents are becoming more awake, certainly with COVID and remote learning. And quite honestly, thank you to your podcast, because I can't tell you how many people that I've shared it with, constituents I've shared it with, who felt that they were out there alone. But here we come now where there's a desire to help. I can speak for my colleagues on the Senate Education Committee. We want to help. We've learned a great deal today, but I have no actionable items that I can take back. And even if I do, there's questions that need to be resolved. What is the state's role on mandating things to the local school districts? Shouldn't that be, I ran for state senate, I didn't run for my local school board. So should we do something? And the question then is, in Wisconsin, how can we do something when our governor is part of the educational establishment that may be reluctant to do anything in this budget process? So I'm very appreciative, but I'm also more frustrated right now than I ever have been, because I don't know what to do. We want to do a joint hearing, me and the Assembly Education, my colleague in the Assembly Education Committee, but I don't even know what that agenda looks like right now. Because if the educational establishment can't come together, how can, we want to help, I guess.
Well, you need to reach out to Kymyona, because she talked about the elements and she has model legislation, and she can tell you about specifics of what other states have done.
Yeah.
I'd like to add something to that. I think one of the obstacles is that these get turned into political issues immediately, and that the issues that exist in the state of Wisconsin predate the current governor, the previous governor, and at least go back to when I was here 20 years ago. So I think the problems of pulling together are really on both sides of the aisle, and that what we should be focusing on is how to move forward and not casting blame.
I'm certainly not trying to do that.
Yeah.
I'm certainly not trying to do that. All I'm saying is there's a desire to help here, and what is the role of state governments to do that, as opposed to giving out information and letting the locals do it.
So I'll share at the end, I come back up and I'll share some policy solutions, of course, with those fundamental principles, and I have some model policies for you. I'll say this about local control. Mississippi is a local control state. There are so many states that are local control states. Sometimes there's an absence of stakeholder awareness or stakeholder knowledge. How many people are sitting on school boards who have no idea about any of this, but they're the ones who are signing off on the purchases of LLI or the purchases of all of these other materials? So we have to begin to inform and educate those who are making these decisions. And again, there's model policy. However, like we've said before, passing a law is a first step. It's a great first step, because what's happening is there are some good things happening in some schools. It's just not happening everywhere, and that's the problem. So passing a law is the first step, but then implementation is what is key. And so we really have to, after policymakers or legislators pass the law, well, hopefully if your governor will sign off on it. But it's going to take this. It's going to take a room like this and people like you who are saying something different has to be done, and holding those accountable for what needs to happen. So yeah, we have some resources for that. And that's why I started the conversation about with, is it a lack of knowledge or a lack of will Because we also can't say, well, we're not going to pass a law because local control is going to. No, we have to pass the law and then require those who are in local control to learn more about it. And I was telling the group last night about Ernie Ortiz, who says we have to be informed, not influenced. We have to learn for ourselves. We can't just say our neighbor is doing something, so we're going to do it. You have to learn for yourselves. And I've talked to a lot of state boards of education lately who are now saying, we want to know for ourselves. We hear everyone else talking about it, now we want to know. And I think that our local school boards are going to have to be next so that they can make the right decisions. All right, we have one more.
Can I just say one
Yep.
thing? I very appreciate, sort of want to acknowledge the frustration that you were just talking
That's
about, and that I'm glad you have your job and I have my job, and but. So I'm just sitting here thinking really hard, like what would really be a helpful thing to do? I don't know if this is a good answer, but I think that if you're a legislator here in Wisconsin, you should talk to some of the people in this room who know what's going on in schools in Wisconsin, and you should go visit some schools that are making changes and trying to figure it out. And start there. Really start there so that whatever you eventually do, don't feel like you have to go back to your office and do something today. Go learn some more. Go give this some more thought. Talk to your colleagues, but go and talk to the educators who are really trying to do something good. They might not be doing the perfect thing, but they're trying and they're dealing with what's hard, and they can tell you what they need. Like they can be like, this is actually what would help from the state. This is actually what a policy could do, and don't bother doing that. That's not going to help me. That's what I would do.
Yeah.
So my question relates a little bit more to accountability, and what I mean by that is assessment. So one of you said, how do we define, quote, taught how to read? That we need to ensure that they are taught how to read. And I'm wondering, in terms of assessments and the different cutoff scores for all the different assessments that the districts do, how does one district navigate that? Because when I look at your long list of all the things that need to be in place, and absolutely agree on that, there's a difference between progress monitoring or formative assessments, and then of course your summative assessments, which are your large forward assessments, or even an interim assessment like MAP or STAR. Oftentimes in our formative assessments, we're using a discrete skill. And then we're using the cutoff scores for norms for those discrete skills. And we could see huge increases in that don't necessarily then show up on the forward the same way that the discrete skills do. So in thinking about ways that we might be held accountable as districts, how have other states kind of come into that and recognized that issue and said, okay, well, on this test, 25th percentile is considered low average, but on this test, you need to be in the 61st percentile to be considered proficient. It gets confusing and frustrating for districts. It gets confusing and frustrating for teachers when we just have such different measurements for such different things. And then knowing that this could be legalized, could really make us nervous in K-12 systems.
I understand. To respond to that, and it goes back to policy as well, there are states with lists. So even if you say, of course, you don't want to name vendors in legislation, right? But you can name criteria. We're screening students all the time. Are we screening them for the right things? So these are the criteria for the screeners. But again, there are states that have released lists. They have a task force or a committee of experts who say, these are the criteria and these are the assessments or curricula or whatever it is that actually meet this criteria. Districts must choose from that list. That's policy. So when you think about the different assessments, and the discrepancies possibly with the cut scores. But now you're dealing with assessments that are more aligned as it relates to what the criteria are that students are being assessed for. If you have, I think with Wisconsin's law, for universal screening, I think students only have to be assessed for, is it phonemic awareness and letter naming? That's it.
Right, but
But there are all of these other things that should be assessed as well. So if you're adopting screeners across the board for any district and they all assess for the same things, those multiple skills that we need, then there shouldn't be that big of a discrepancy between what those cut scores say. However, you're also supposed to, and you know this, ensure that you are not using just one measure to identify where kids are and also what they need. Do you want to respond to that, Mark?
No, I'm thinking over the question of what the role of government is and what we could do. And obviously, it's not an easy question. I think I focus on things that would make it easier for teachers to succeed. Mm-hmm. And I think, one of the big bottlenecks is the schools of education. They have not moved. And so, I'm an academic, and I've pursued a life of research in which I was able to follow my interests and instincts, and that was great. Academics don't like being told what to do. But the history of the schools of education, some of which I talked about in the book, is such that they've just never been on board. And it's really hard to get the right stuff in the door. So I do think the time has come to say, hold them accountable. You need to do a better job preparing people for the job. This is what it includes. It's not just making the test, the test to get your
certification.
Licensure.
It's not just making the licensure test harder. It's making it so that teachers understand why the stuff on the licensure test is relevant and how to make use of it. So I think they need to be held accountable. And that might be like the curricula, the authors of the curricula. It might be something that it takes legislation to really get them finally to move. I have concerns because I'm not sure if you say to them, well, you need to teach things that are aligned with the science of reading and it includes this, this, and this. Who's going to teach it? Because they don't have a history of doing that. But it's a trajectory, and I think that is one of the big bottlenecks. No offense to people who were trained within the system. People do cope. People do go beyond. People are not limited to what they learn in school, thankfully. But, gee, it would be better if we had people trained better, and we know what that would include.
And I'll say one more thing about assessments. One of the representatives asked me to speak to a group of people. A few were teachers, one was a pastor, right? And the teacher said, we're assessing kids so much. You all just want us to assess kids more? And I said, well, what are you using? And she said, well, we're using iReady, we're using STAR. And I said, well, wait, why are you using both of those? Like they do the same thing. Well, this is what our district is telling us that we need to do. Well, what are you doing with the data? Well, we just have to. So I'm saying all of this to say it's extremely important to know what is actually going to be in policy if Wisconsin takes that route. And what are just some things that, again, you've had a school leader who is trying to do his or her best, but has heard that, okay, well, STAR is good or iReady is good, and sometimes you have to sit there and just take an analysis of what are we doing and why. And if it's not leading us to improving student outcomes or providing that specific support that our children need, then we don't need to do that. That is when the conversations become, you all are having us do so much. Again, I was in the class, I know all of that. You get this one thing. What we want is, again, for the business of school. You're already buying curricula. Let's make sure it's the right one. You're already purchasing screeners. Let's make sure it's the right one, right? You have PD on your calendar. We know that. Let's make sure it's the right PD that's going to give you the knowledge and empower you and give you the things that you need in order to make instructional decisions. I think that we just have to have a shift in mindset about what we're doing. In other fields, we're always thinking about what we're doing and how we can do them better. And it's like people have just drawn lines in the sand and just, well, I don't want that. But there's no rationale for why not. There's, so all of those things. So we're just going to have some real conversations about what we're already doing and why it's not working for Wisconsin kids. It's just not. So what else can we do? And how can we do it better? And I'll take, you and you, sir, and then, well, we have the time. We'll go into Donna's presentation.
I'll make
after
mine a
that.
short question. My name is Jonathan Berry. I've got a checkered past, having been serving in the legislature for a few terms and the county executive here in Dane County, and then chairing the State Technical College System Board and serving on the Board of Regents for 13 years. I have good timing. I got 3 Rose Bowls out of that deal. But my question is you addressed it, Mr. Seidenberg. The schools of education are part of a system in Wisconsin. We don't really have a unified approach. We have citadels of education. We've got an independently elected superintendent that really can't be very responsive to the legislature. The legislature is dealing with the university, and it's a scattered target. It's like moving a battleship with your bare hands or something. And honestly, we really do need to bring accountability into the higher educational efforts towards creating our teachers. We just simply do, and there need to be metrics. And we have to look at you, and all of those who are able to research this, as to what kind of metrics would be fair and could be applied and would be flexible enough that could grow with the need. Because the universities, I remember when my wife came home and I was newly appointed to the Board of Regents, and I was outside in front of the farm with a post hole digger putting in a new, larger mailbox to handle all the stuff that the Regents system was sending me. This is before internet. And it's very, very easy to get lost if you're a legislator on this. We need guidance on specifically how can we instill metrics into higher education from the schools of education. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a Mark question.
Sure, I'm a scientist. I think all of these decisions, it's easy to identify what needs to be done, and doing so is really the start. And drawing on various people's varied kinds of expertise is just key. But beyond that, we're entering new territory, right? We're trying to change a system that has been in place and the way it is for a long time. Those reading scores have not changed very much over a very long period of time. They're basically pretty steady. So we've dug a deep hole. And I think we know what the elements are. I think we know things not to do. It's not just 3Qing, Here's a litmus test for a curriculum. A lot of curriculum work just fine, assuming that because they outsource a lot of stuff to the home. They say, well, we're not going to actually cover this. Basically, we're only going to touch on this stuff in class, and it's going to be up to the parent or someone else in the home to follow through. The reasons for that are pressures on time in school, doing things inefficiently, having to teach many other things besides reading, and so on. But the net result is this curriculum will work well as long as there's our resources in the home and community to fill the gaps. Things that people my age or your age, might have learned in school, they're now getting outsourced to the home and community. Well, that is built into many curricula, and that is a way to magnify differences in economic status. So that will work for people who have the resource, and it will disadvantage people who don't. So that will increase gaps. So one criterion you might make is how much is this going to be done? How much can we rely upon, make this something where we can rely on the school to actually teach the child, as opposed to relying on people elsewhere who may not have relevant expertise, who may not speak the language, who may not have the resources, take responsibility for it. So I don't know. I've never been able to change any policy about anything. But I do think there's a lot to build from here, not just using methods that are going to make things worse, drawing to the extent we can on some of these basic ideas from research, like keep your eye on the goal, folks. You don't get a special prize for being able to know 44 phonemes. You get it for reading. And so, we'll incorporate more and more of this stuff. Yeah.
I'll add to that. So in Mississippi and in other states, Wisconsin is one of the states that has adopted a science of reading assessment for licensure. Mark touched on it earlier, that candidates upon exiting programs must take this science of reading assessment, and if they pass it, they're able to begin their career. If they don't, then they're not. Now, one thing that happened in Mississippi, we were the same thing with higher ed. It was, for us, we said, we'll go another route. We'll have this assessment. So the first year when we received data and we saw that some of our premier universities, their students were not passing this assessment on the first try, right? Then the conversation became, okay, how can we get faculty on board? Because I'll say this, we started letters training, and this is not a plug, but we started letters training in 2014 for our teachers. I personally called faculty at the universities and said we're offering letters training also to faculty. There were 2 professors who said they would do it. Once they received all the materials, they said, never mind. All right, so then 2 years later, we passed the law of the Foundations of Reading Assessment. Once we got the scores back, there were parents of college students calling me at the Department of Education saying, my child cannot begin her career because she didn't pass this test. So now what's going to happen? Then the university started saying, okay, so about this training you were offering, right? So it's also about increasing faculty knowledge. We went through accountability a different way for the fact that they have to have making sure that their candidates are exiting their programs. But what we also found with reporting was that we now have to focus on initial pass rate. There are things that you find out along the way, because there were some schools that weren't reporting pass rates until they passed, instead of how many times it actually took them to take the test. So those are the things that we have to work out, but accountability in that way. But then again, holding them accountable, but also, as I mentioned earlier, providing them with the knowledge. I can't hold someone accountable for something that I haven't told them about or given them an opportunity to learn more about. So how can we do this in a way where, and that's the piece with higher ed that we have to tackle, you know, with tenure, with all of these things. How can we ensure that for course program approval, that faculty who are teaching reading must have so many hours in science or reading professional development? Those are some metrics that I would begin to incorporate and give a runway of however long, not too long, but to say if you're going to be teaching this course within 2 years, you should have taken coursework, modules, whatever it is, training on the science of reading in order to teach this course. Loads may get lighter for some people, but right, there can be others who come into that space who are saying, I'm going to do what I need to do, get the knowledge, what I need to get in order to prepare our future teachers.
Can I just add something to that? I'm in favor of raising the bar on teacher preparation and licensure and so on. However, historically, those measures have always been accompanied by exceptions because we need enough people to mount the program.
Yeah.
This has happened in Wisconsin. So there always has to be another route into the profession because you need enough people to be able to, in the classrooms. So licensure is not sufficient. It's giving the people the knowledge and knowing why it's important and how to use it. The second thing is, I don't think it's really the science of reading. It's a course in linguistics that tells you about how language works. It's a course in cognitive psychology that tells you how thinking and learning work. It's a course in development, modern course in development that tells about how children learn and how what they can learn now depends on what they already know and changes over time. I mean, I think we have existing courses on campuses in these areas. You don't have to design, you can have for 20 years I taught a course on the science of reading and its educational implications. It was not listed in the ed school, but you can have that kind of course. But the real foundations are really, it's about a course about language, it's a course about cognition, it's a course about development, and there's a course about how to put it together for teaching. And we could do that.
Yeah. Okay, one
Just
question.
just a quick follow-up on your state requirements for teachers. In the Mississippi example, Wisconsin had something called the Foundations of Reading, which
That's what we have.
right.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's important for everybody to understand that what actually happened in Wisconsin is it was passed and implemented, but then thousands of teachers who didn't pass it had their requirement waived. And, it's a huge thing. And I'm not saying that we have the right policies, but it's hard to change practices. But that just completely undermined the intention. And
Yeah.
so here we are, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But the politicians had a chance to do something about it, and they didn't. So there you are. Anyway, I'll leave it to Dave.
Okay.
Okay, the disclaimer is I'm not an educator, I'm not a politician, I'm a peddler. I've been in international business all my life. And to Dr. Burke's question of why have we not executed in Wisconsin, I think another factor is the lack of benchmarking. This is a competitive state. Green Bay Packers, they don't win, look out for the coach, okay? And I think that if there's clarity where we want to go, and with Dr. Burke's benchmarking with Mississippi, with Florida, blacks and whites, fourth grade reading, and not just announce it to educators, but ad nauseum, put that out there, much less age 15 and start taking the PISA test, so because the world of business is global these days, and see how we in Wisconsin are doing. If that's done enough, I think that's another factor that will finally get the system to say, hey, we've got to change, as many of you have suggested. And with benchmarking, of course, if it's good, just like the Packers, you can monitor it, not just the educators or the experts or the journalists, but every citizen can see how we're doing in the past, what we want to do in the future, and put pressure on the people that make the decisions.
Yeah.
Comment, please.
Thank you. Well, I was wondering first if you knew if Aaron Rodgers was about to retire, if you had any intel on that. That was my first question.
Well,
but then my second question is...
At Lambeau Field, I think there's more preference for that Mississippi boy Favre these days than for Aaron Rodgers. But anyway.
Yeah, that's, to your point, we've shared data, we've testified in committee, but it's about making sure that the same way with Emily's reporting, where is it landing? Like is this type of, and now it's being live streamed, which is great, but are these conversations really happening where they need to? So not just this national data, NAEP is every 2 years. Your state assessment, is it rigorous? Is it aligned to these standards? How are students performing there? And I want to say something about a third grade law, and I know we need to take a quick break, but a third grade law is not just a third grade teacher's responsibility. And I think that there's so much pressure put on teachers when they begin the phase where their class is the class that's being assessed, with state testing, and like third grade teachers, oh my God, we have to teach them how to read in third grade. No. We have to begin that process when they first enter our doors in kindergarten. So it's every teacher who touches every child who can pass the baton and say, I got them ready for you, right? And then it's the teacher that says, and I'm prepared for them. So it's not just one teacher's responsibility, it's gonna take everyone. And when we begin to share data at district school board meetings, because I always say your agenda reflects your priorities. If you're in a district and no one's talking about data at school board meetings, then what's the priority, right? How are our kids doing? And we have to begin to demand that from our schools. So it's about this conversation, you're exactly right. How well are we doing nationally, but also how well are we doing in districts so that districts can begin to take pride in what they're doing and see where the holes are and how they can help fill those gaps.
Yeah, and I would just add, in this dissatisfaction with education, it's not just the experts or certain teachers. There's a lot of dissatisfaction among the business community.
Yes.
And the work force that we've been inheriting for the last 30 or 40 years in terms of basic skills versus the Europeans and the Asians, versus work ethic, versus problem solving. So you've got the business community that's concerned also. I don't know if they're represented today. You have people with the real concern for social mobility, and they should be represented. You can throw in also the national security interests. So there is this I would say, large number of citizens that have the concern that's being expressed today, but how the heck in Wisconsin we start executing is another question.
You want to respond to that, Mark?
Yeah, that is a challenge, and this kind of meeting is a start. I just have like one example of something I would like to see either government or business or philanthropy take up. So, you know, if you want to change teacher education, it's going to get a little bit more rigorous. And it might involve some additional courses. And questions arise about who's going to be willing to go into that, take on that extra burden, and it's going to cost extra money. So there's also a question about, you know, who's entering education, trying to get as many good people as we can, and so on. I think that it would be a really fantastic plan to create a program in which people who go into an elementary education program with some rigor and take on these additional burdens and graduate and agree to teach in Wisconsin schools for 10 years or 5 years, that we do it in a way such that they graduate debt-free. So just subsidized. It's a lot less expensive than many other things that we spend money on. And the idea of getting a first-rate education, being prepared for the job, knowing that you're going to have a job, and knowing that you're doing it without, on a scholarship essentially, in return, I think would really attract more people, more good people into the field, and result in better outcomes for them and for the people in the schools.
Yeah, we have a critical need for teacher scholarship in Mississippi where students are in college, they know when they exit, then they have to go to certain areas that are identified as critical.
People always want to buy things and build things, and I think we should invest in the people.
Invest in people. All right, so this is a great place to stop. We can take about a 5-minute break, and then Donna will come, and we're going to tackle higher education. Okay. For our last presentation of the day, and again, be reminded that we will have a short time for Q&A where we will have Donna, Mark, and Emily on stage. So right now, Donna is about to talk about the Wisconsin barriers and solutions in evidence-based practices. All right, Donna.
Thank you, Kymyona. Thank you. So I'm wondering if I use the right word. Is it evidence or research? I don't know. I'm hoping I'm right. So, hello. Yeah, 1976 was a really busy year. Emily was entering first grade. I was entering my first classroom, and as a teacher. And so what happened was I got hired for North Chicago, and I worked in Illinois. And I worked on a naval base, the Forrestal School. So I walk into my trailer, you know, next to the school, and I remember looking around thinking, how do I teach kids to read? I really do. And so what do? You know, you're young, naive, you don't know what you're doing. You call your mother. Called my mom, and she said, well, you use sounds and letters. I'm like, that makes sense. Why didn't I know that? I just got the degree and I didn't know what I was doing. So let's fast forward. I retired 5 years ago. After 41 years in education, I was a special education teacher and / turned reading interventionist specialist. But now I'm a reading advocate. I'm here today to tell you my story, what's happened to me as a teacher, and many other teachers in the state I know have similar stories, not only the state, but the country. In 2011, I served on the Read to Lead Council for 4 years. That was legislation that came about, and it really was non-productive. In 2018 through 19, I served on the Legislative Study Committee on dyslexia, which resulted in Act 86, the Dyslexia Guidebook, Guidebook on Dyslexia and Related Conditions. And for Wisconsin, it was the first recognition of the word dyslexia. It was a huge moment for us because that word has never been spoken in this state before. Most recently, in 1921, Senate Bill 454, Roadmap to Reading Success, was vetoed on the governor's desk, unfortunately. Me and many others that are in this room, some of my folks are in this room, have been working relentlessly for 10, 15 years to get things changed. And I'm here not to blame or to shame. I'm here to tell you what those barriers are and how they can be mitigated. I'm here to tell you my experiences and the thousands of other teachers that I hear from on a daily basis. Because as you see, I was frustrated in 2019. I was doing legislative work. I was testifying a lot. And I remember talking to the Senate Education Committee, and I said to them, I'm going to write a book one day, and it's going to be called The Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College. I never wrote the book. I'm a terrible writer. But I discovered that Facebook has this thing called groups. Who knew? And I click on groups, and I'm like, it says, what's the name of your group? I'm like, Science of Reading, What I Should Have Learned in College. Well, within weeks, days, my numbers kept growing. That was 3.5 years ago. And today, I just checked it, we're at 197,000 members. We represent 108 countries. And I hear from teachers all the time who have been through the system and they can't teach reading. They don't know how to teach reading. Okay. So we're going to talk about, too many. We're going to talk about barriers in Wisconsin. And I want to preface this. This is my understanding. This is how I see things. I'm sure there's other opinions here, and that's fine, that's great, but this is how I see them. So barrier number one is our Wisconsin reading curriculum, although I think I've been verified with what we talked about. First thing I want to say is that what the research tells us is that 90 to 95% of all students can achieve literacy skills approaching grade level, including students with dyslexia. And this was research that was conducted. Okay, so why in Wisconsin are only 37% of our students, 37% of our students are below basic, as seen on the National Assessment of Educational Progress 2022. So 1 in 3 students are below basic. In a survey that was conducted by the DPI back in 2021, 681 districts responded, which is 80% of reporting, okay? Out of those districts, 21% are using Lucy Calkins units of study, 19% are using Fontes and Pinnell, 12% are using Journeys, 12% are teacher developed, and 12% are district developed. Ed Reports is an independent nonprofit organization designed to improve K-12 education. It was used to evaluate the popular Wisconsin instructional materials and if they met expectations or did not. And this is what we found. In 21% of districts 21% of our districts use Fontes and Pinnell, and it does not meet expectations. 19% of our districts are using Lucy Calkins units of study. Does not meet expectations. 12% of our districts are using Journeys, and it does not meet expectations. And who knows what's going on in these districts, because it's teacher developed and teacher district developed. In total, 76% of our school districts are using curriculum that does not meet expectations, according to Ed Reports, or curriculum that has no rating. Barrier number 2, teacher training programs. Now, we've heard a lot about this today. I'm just going to reiterate. Every teacher deserves to know the science of reading, and every child deserves a teacher who knows it. And this is by the National Center for Teacher Quality. Unfortunately, this is not the case in Wisconsin and many other states across the nation. All right, here's another story for you. So, you know, it's a funny thing about education. You get your picture taken every year, right? And you can see 2 things. Your hair is changing, and you're getting older. So here I am. In 2011, I was hired as a reading interventionist in Northland Pines, Eagle River, and I needed a 316 credential, which is the reading teacher's license. I chose an online UW school, and my reading teacher course of study was steeped in practice, not supported by brain research, often referred to as whole language or balanced literacy. And in fact, much of it was reading recovery based, and you've heard about reading recovery today, that it's not effective. In fact, these approaches to coursework are promoted and have been found to be detrimental to students. In 2011, in my first course, I shared with a friend, a reading advocate, my disappointment with my coursework. My friend filed a complaint to DPI on my behalf. The school's representative called me up at my home and asked me to find another school to attend. Unfortunately, it would not have mattered where I went to school in Wisconsin because 13 Wisconsin schools of education did not follow the science. Here we are, 12 years later, and to my knowledge, only 2 private and 2 public schools are now following the science in their reading coursework. The cost of that reading certificate was $7,000, and it's very unfortunate that teachers are not getting the training they need to be highly effective teachers to this day. Most Wisconsin professors and adjunct are not trained in evidence-based practices founded in the science. Courses of study are grounded in outdated practices and approaches and limit the pre-service teachers in understanding best practices and high-quality instructional materials. Administrators, they're not off the hook either. Sorry. Oops. I'm missing something here. Okay. Well, I have a slide about administrators. I don't know where that's at. Okay. So administrators, just like teachers, they really went through the same program, so they didn't get the training either. They're not trained in implementation science, and they need to understand data and affect change. They can only lead with what they know. Okay? The National Center for Teacher Quality, NCTQ as it's known, was founded in 2000. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization solely dedicated to issues of teacher quality. And its mission is to ensure that every child has effective teachers and every teacher has the opportunity to be effective through research-driven practices. So there's a lot to read here, so I'm going to summarize it for you. In Wisconsin, the good news is that teacher prep policy that ensures new elementary teachers demonstrate sufficient knowledge is met because of the Foundations of Reading test requirement that was established in 2014. However, the reality is that the preparation standards do not address the science of reading instruction for elementary and middle school. And let me explain why. Okay? NCTQ recommends NCTQ recommendations finds that considerable evidence that nearly 74% of our teacher prep programs fail to cover all 5 components of scientifically based reading instruction. Wisconsin should exercise its leverage in the program approval process to ensure that the coursework is appropriately focused on the science of reading and that the state play a more active and supportive role in remediating the gaps on the part of the faculty teaching these courses. So NCTQ is recommending that our state, DPI, help out these schools of ed, because they're struggling. Here is a graph of the results of the Foundations of Reading test in the past 5 years. We don't have, this is the most up-to-date information I could find. And if you can see, the blue is the first time pass rate. The red is the any attempt. And there's been problems with that. In fact, there's been some teacher candidates who had to take the test 5, 6, 7. I know of one case it was 25 times before passing. Okay? With the poor passage rates across Wisconsin on the Fort, it would be my hope that both DPI and the schools of higher ed would take a serious look at why this is happening. For pre-service students of color, the passage rate in 2019 is a grim 26 to 37%. The next few slides shares what Wisconsin did as a workaround. I thought I'd put a little joke in there, but it's really not funny. Wisconsin workarounds. Act 44 in 2019 did a workaround for special education students, special education teacher certification. It waived the Fort exam for special ed candidates, and I understand why. There's a teacher shortage. I get that. But what they substituted for the Fort was really interesting. They want the candidates to have successful completion of rigorous instruction in the teaching of phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, reading, comprehension, and fluency. Why isn't that being done in school? Receive feedback and coaching from an expert of reading instruction. Why isn't that being done in school? And demonstrate competency in phonemic awareness, phonics, etc. by a portfolio. Why isn't that being done in school? Okay? Unfortunately, the schools of education are given a pass when their students can't pass a competency exam. So what happens when we have things like this? There's costly teacher training after college. This is some examples of what's going on across the country. North Carolina requires LETRS, which stands for Language Essentials of Teachers of Reading and Spelling, and it costs North Carolina $12 million for 1 year. And the training is extensive. It's 160 hours. It's very, very long. New Hampshire has a $5 million initiative, and they're doing LETRS as well. But when you consider the additional costs of teacher time out of the classroom, away from family, substitute costs, teacher burnout, all of this should be taught in college, and it's not. Another barrier is that pre-service teachers in the field work are most likely placed with teachers that have no knowledge of research-based approaches, and they train their student teachers using unresearched material. So, you know, when student teachers go out into the field, you know, you just idolize your supervising teacher, and you'll do anything they say, and what they show you is what you're using. That's all you know. And if they're using unresearched materials, it perpetuates this problem. To my knowledge, these are the only few schools and CSAs that are using teacher prep and trained aligned to the science of reading out of the 13 public higher ed schools. Okay, there might be more. I just don't know about them. Okay, barrier number 3. As I see it, there's a lack of urgency from our Department of Public Instruction. There's a lack of urgency from the districts and the Wisconsin State Reading Association. The lack of leadership in the state has brought a significant decline in Wisconsin reading scores. Districts need guidance and are not getting it. Local control can be good, But without guidance and on curriculum, assessments, and interventions, many flounder. 20 years after the National Reading Panel's recommendations, which are, you've heard this before, phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary fluency, comprehension, those were the recommendations to be taught explicitly and systematically. Countless legislative attempts in Wisconsin by advocacy groups have fallen on deaf ears. In 2020, DPI created the Foundational Reading Skills tool for districts to use. It's a self-evaluation on teaching foundational skills. And in 2021, supplied school districts with some guidance on choosing high-quality instructional materials. So that was 20 years after the National Reading Panel. And Wisconsin finally put something out on the website that we could use that could help us make decisions in districts. Wisconsin State Reading Association has over 2,000 members. It has a strong hold in Wisconsin. It's keeping Wisconsin from moving forward through their lobbying efforts. WSIR leadership has failed to recognize and promote evidence-based practices, and districts continue to send teachers to their annual conference, which keeps out presenters aligned to evidence-based practices. Districts pay for these teachers to attend these annual conferences, and they receive information that is not evidence-based. Lack of urgency. Historically, Wisconsin was highly regarded, fourth in the nation, but over time has slipped to 27th in 2019. 37% of students in Wisconsin are below basic in their literacy skills. That's 1 out of 3. And for children of color, 68% are below basic. That's 2 out of 3. What if this was your child? What would you do to mitigate these statistics? All right, this is not all gloom and doom. We're going to find some solutions. What can districts do? Districts can make leadership and teacher training of evidence-based practices a priority in order to improve outcomes for students. Look critically at your systems, your structures, the core curriculum, your intervention systems, your universal testing, and don't be afraid to hire a consultant that has a trained eye to evaluate systems and structures and make recommendations. Here are some examples of training that's out there that's excellent. It's already been done. We need to start utilizing these trainings. Just like the teachers, the administrators need training. Okay, here's some examples of some amazing training that's available for administrators. Now, Connecticut did a really interesting thing, and I'd love to see Wisconsin do this. They created the Right to Read legislation, which created the Center for Literacy Research and Reading Success to provide oversight over a statewide systemized response to reading for grades K through 3. It explicitly requires all the districts to implement evidence-based curricula based on the science of reading, which will be pre-approved by the state, thereby formally shifting Connecticut public schools away from the balanced literacy model that has been identified as ineffective for too many students. The center will be responsible for collecting data on the district's implementation, providing professional development, overseeing aligned interventions, and teacher prep programs. So we take and create a new agency. A new agency to take care of what needs to be done. And then there's Louisiana. They're getting it, okay? So what did they do? Evidence-based training before they graduate from college. Louisiana requires, before graduation, foundational literacy skills standards in all education prep programs of all candidates seeking certification to teach students in kindergarten through grade 3. These foundational skills, along with high-quality instructional materials, can help teachers teach reading effectively for all learners. Pennsylvania, they hit at both sides. School personnel and higher ed, okay? Now I know you can't see, did I miss one? No. There we go. Teacher training before, not after. Since 2019, at least 26 states have passed laws intended to help teachers learn about the science of reading, or to get schools to implement what researchers have found about how kids learn to read. And I took this from Ed Week, July of 22. It might even be more. Kymyona would know that. But I can assure you Wisconsin is not on here. Okay? Here's some really good news. Motion 57, the American Rescue Act, built into this proposal that has passed a landscape analysis that schools of education could take advantage of. We're hoping that all 13 Wisconsin schools of higher ed participate in this opportunity to review coursework, clinical practice, and observe schools of ed that will provide actionable and impactful recommendations. DPI will grant up to $100K for each participating institution at the completion of the analysis and the adoption of a program improvement plan. The summary of reports to DPI will be anonymous and identify trends, but not the institutions. This is a chance for those Wisconsin institutions to take advantage of learning, to get someone like a consultant to come in and review the programming that is being done. And here's some other good news. We have a district in Wisconsin. It's called New Berlin School District, and they've partnered with Carroll University. They're sitting over there. Hi, New Berlin. They are taking 34 pre-service teachers into SOR classrooms in January. Or they did, right? Yep, 34. So we're going to have 34 teachers that are going to be hopefully aligned more with the science of reading, because they didn't get that in college. And District Administrator Joe Garza, we can do better and we have to do better. Okay. Each system is perfectly designed to give you exactly what you're getting today. So we're getting the exact results we should be getting with the way our system is set up in the districts, in the state, in the country, actually. We're getting what we're designed to do. So something has to change. And finally, just imagine this. All Wisconsin students achieving to their potential. Imagine teachers coming to Wisconsin to learn evidence-based teaching practices. Imagine fewer school dropouts and incarcerations. Imagine greater economic prosperity for all. And imagine doing the right thing for Wisconsin students. Just imagine. Thank you.
All right, I think I do have just a couple more slides. Emily and Mark and Donna, don't leave. If you can make your way to the stage, we're going to try to get just a few more questions in to allow opportunities for a few more questions before you all leave today. And so the question was asked, so what do we do now? So what are the approaches to implementing early literacy policies? For many of our students, it's not a lack of ability, it's a lack of access and opportunities. So how do we remove these barriers and change barriers to opportunities for our teachers and administrators, our students, our parents and families? So teachers and leaders need access to, and you see Scarborough's rope there, there's all the knowledge that teachers need to ensure that they are able to first show up to be able to teach students, to begin to teach students how to read. So our educator preparation programs align to the science of reading, intentional student teaching placements. I don't think we've talked about that enough. For our candidates who will be doing their student teaching, making sure that they are actually placed with a teacher intentionally in a school, in a classroom that is already practicing this evidence-based approach to teach children how to read. So be intentional about that. professional learning, literacy coaches, high quality instructional materials. So teachers and leaders need access to these things. Oh, and the last thing, of course, is data.
Yeah.
Last but not least, data, right? We need to know where children are to get them to where they need to be. We also need to know where teachers' knowledge, where they are in that. All right, so students and families need access to high quality learning experiences, early learning experiences. Teachers who are knowledgeable of the science of reading, screeners. So we talk about the importance of screening students very early on with vision and hearing, and we also need to screen them for reading and dyslexia, right? So even all of those things, there was this ophthalmologist, the Ophthalmologist Association in Mississippi partnered with the Department of Education. Our students who did not pass the reading assessment for 3rd grade, the Ophthalmology Association said that they would screen them for vision for free, because they wondered if for some kids, was it because they had some issues with their vision, right? And they found out there were so many kids who needed glasses. Yeah. All right, so screeners are important. Interventions and or tutoring support, enrichment opportunities. We talk a lot about deficiencies, but there are children out there who are ready, and we don't need to forget those students. They need to have more rigorous experiences, they need to be challenged, and we need to provide the spaces for that. And then, of course, resources for parents. So we have a comprehensive early literacy model policy on our site that actually addresses all of these things that we've talked about earlier, and that's on ExcelinEd.org. If you just search early literacy, it's there. We also have a resource comprehensive how-to guide. So we're talking about all of these things, and we want to know, how do you do this? And I think that Ruth put the resource out front about this how-to guide. And then I mentioned earlier, we just released our Early Literacy Matters website, where you can click on your state, how can your state improve, and it will tell you exactly which of these fundamental principles are missing. And we have an early literacy network, a network of states that have adopted early literacy laws, and there are some states that haven't yet, but they have people who are interested. And this includes now 28 states plus D.C. That I meet with my team, my 2 colleagues in early literacy, that we meet with quarterly to discuss implementation practices and to highlight innovative approaches. So there's support, right? We have a support group, how about that? And so lastly, America's low literacy crisis is largely ignored, historically underfunded, and woefully under-researched, despite being one of the great solvable problems of our time. All right, last Q&A, get ready. We'll go straight to questions from the audience, if that's okay. And I think we're gonna do about 10 minutes. Let me watch my step.
Yeah.
And may I also have the clinics?
I want to just move that.
Thank you.
Hey.
Do you all know who this is?
Yes, we do.
The gang's all here. How you doing, Steve?
One of the problems, and one of the problems that has come up in Wisconsin when we've tried to do things both formally in legislation and informally behind the scenes, is that there's a very high expectation that we'll have unanimous or near unanimous agreement that this needs to be done. That if there are corners of the world, corners of the state, they're saying, no, I don't think this is the right time, or this isn't perfect for me, I can't endorse this, that then we aren't going to do anything. At what point do we stop worrying about extreme consensus or near unanimity and just do it anyway?
It's a great question. And I talk a lot. Who wants to take that? I'll start by saying I think that we should go with the willing. We have to just start. And there are some states that aren't waiting on legislation. They're saying we're going to do what we need to do. Maryland has a grant program where they're trying to bring people on board to the science of reading, and school districts can apply for these grants, and the grants will allow them to change their curriculum. You can get funding for changing your curriculum, you can get funding for literacy coaches, you can get funding for professional development. Maryland has a K-1 reading law And so they know that they need to expand that, but they're starting with grants. We still have a lot of money, and they're saying we're going to start with the willing. So there are instances of that.
Well, I'm seeing it's almost a grassroots movement that has to happen because people are not doing it, but the urgency isn't there, but it's starting to happen. And so when districts, you know, New Berlin is an example. I mean, there's others in our state, but it's starting to catch on. I mean, it's just starting to catch on. And so that's where you just have to just run with it and go with it and hope other people find the urgency as important as it is.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's essential to note that the teachers have to be on board. It's not going to succeed if teachers are coerced. And so what that means is better sharing of knowledge and rationale for things, not just telling people what to do. So yeah, we should move ahead, but in an intelligent way. The other thing is there's a lot of disinformation out there. Mm-hmm. You know, I've testified along with Donna and others, and Steve and others, a lot of times. Mm-hmm. And I'll get my 5 minutes as the expert to talk about some topic, you know, dyslexia or teaching, or, you know, reading or something, screening. What do you do with screening? The agenda, the docket includes, you know, a lot of people with a lot of different perspectives, and then the legislators are sort of sitting there going, who don't agree. So the Wisconsin State Reading Association, there's always a person from them there to say to defend the status quo. And then I imagine the legislators are sitting there going, like, well, I don't know who to believe. These people argue and they disagree, so we can't really do anything. That's got to stop. I mean, there's things that are true and there are things that are not. And there are ways, there's evidence for how to move forward, and there's evidence against the status quo. And, you know, so I think sharing of information and pulling together is important. On the other hand, there's a WSRA meeting in Milwaukee coming right up with exactly, you know, this is not the message that they're getting. And so that is an obstacle. But anyway, teachers have to be on board. And the messaging has to be about how it is empowering them to do the jobs they really want to do, because after all, they want to succeed.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Hi, I'm unaffiliated because I'm a mom, and that's all I am. Because I had a struggling reader, and I had to quit my job to teach him how to read. And I actually worked for the university, but he's a reader now. He can read, and that was the most important thing. But I'll just say, as a parent and a Wisconsinite and a taxpayer here in Madison, and it's incredibly frustrating to know that the teachers coming out of our flagship university are not being taught this information. Like, there's no reason that a teacher coming out of UW-Madison right now should not have this knowledge. And there's no reason 20 years ago that a teacher didn't have this knowledge. So as a regular old person, but with, you know, I've got a lot at stake with this, but there are so many parents who don't know about this at all. Mm-hmm. And I've been in my kids' classrooms and I've seen those other struggling readers, and I know that their parents don't know about this. And that's probably the worst thing. So I guess I want to know, as a regular old person, I listen to my school board meetings here in Madison. Thankfully, we've had a superintendent who's brought the science of reading to MMSD. Our teachers are working overtime to get this knowledge. They're basically doing a master's while they're working. It's a hard lift for them. Mm-hmm. We've got that, but now I'm afraid that it's so hard being a teacher these days. They're going to get this knowledge, and maybe some other district's going to hire them because, you know, they're going to be like top notch. So I guess I'm just wondering, it's hard to get other parents who haven't experienced this to really understand how important it is. You don't hear regular people talking about it on the street at the school board meetings. So what can people like me do to try and effect change?
I'm going to put this to, Emily,
So-
possibly, and Donna.
So there are some organizations in Wisconsin, Wisconsin Reads, Wisconsin Reading League, Decoding Dyslexia, that are very active, and they have websites, and so you can go and talk to a school board, and you can talk to them again and again and again, and just be in their face, and respectfully, and just tell them what needs to change and what you're seeing. And there has to be awareness, and there has to be an urgency. And I keep using the U word, but there really needs to be, and people need to have awareness. And just, reach out. Social media is filled with science of reading information, just filled with it. So that's all I do 24/7. So I can tell you there's a lot of information out there.
Also, following up on this, and it was so joining these organizations is a really great thing. And a lot of the movement that we've had over the last N years about these issues has come from parent-based organizations, so Decoding Dyslexia being one, where people got tired of getting the door shut in their face and not having anything happen. They organized and led to legislation in various states. So, so parent-based groups have been very important in all of this, and that is one place to go. If you can tell us the things that we could do to actually communicate this in other ways, that would also be helpful.
I would say one thing about your story. So, I'm just increasingly convinced that the solution to this problem, and anyone thinking about policies to try to solve this problem, have to take into account what you just said, which is you quit your job to teach your son to read. And what I think we have to remember here is we have gotten our attention now, and I think in a good and important way, on core instruction and just how all kids are being taught how to read, and that's one of the things I've been really wanting to help people understand. At the same time, when you see that number, 95% of kids can read much better than they do now. It doesn't, the proficient on, there's a lot of things about what we're talking about, what level, but we have a lot of research that shows that 95% of kids can get to a significantly higher level than they are now. Those studies included interventions, though, and one-on-one instruction in some cases. And we have to keep that in mind, that we're not, even if we did a snap-up great job and figured out all the things that I think are in the way of getting it right with classroom instruction, classroom instruction's perfect everywhere, there are still going to be kids like your son who need much more. And we have to keep that in mind. And one of the things that I think should really be a part of this is leveraging community support and volunteers and tutors, and because people can be trained well in a program and sit there with a child and do a program, and it will work wonders for that child. And there are good, I'm not a huge fan of lots of technology, but there are good online programs that kids can use. But I think a little kid needs and deserves a human being there with them, guiding them through, even if really the artificial intelligence is doing a lot of the teaching. I just think that really needs to be a part of it, and I think I'm just increasingly convinced that every policy effort needs to keep that in mind. We're not going to reach 95% unless we really commit to that too.
I wholeheartedly agree, and honestly, for those readers who are really struggling, and they're not just suffering from instructional problems. That's why teachers are such special people, because the ability to reach a child who is struggling immensely with something that's maybe the most difficult thing they've ever had to do, having a teacher there who can ride that through with a child is amazing.
Well, we ask being a first grade teacher is such a difficult job. Right now we're asking one person to deal with 18, 20, 26, 36-year-olds who need to be taught how to read and a lot of other things. And they're going to have kids who are struggling. And so even if they were well equipped with the learning science, the cognitive science, the science of reading, linguistics, the structure of the English language, they still have a job that's too hard and too much for them to do alone.
Totally agree.
And I think you should show up with T-shirts to your board meeting that says, "Ask me about the science of reading."
Nice.
We need to get some T-shirts.
There are models elsewhere to build on with respect to these things. We don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yep.
I think that there are a lot of people in the community who would really support having opportunities to help tutor
right.
kids if they had the right tools to do it.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Just handing a book to a kid, you need to teach them how to read.
Yeah, there's a lot of wasted, I think we waste a lot of people's precious time and they really want to help. And I guess I just thought of that when you were talking about how to bring more people on board, because I think there are a lot of people out there already who care about this and a lot more people who could be made to care with a little bit more information, and a lot of people who would give an afternoon a week or 5 mornings a week to teach a kid to read.
All right, we have one question here. Okay, all right. One last question.
I'm Katie Kershbuski, the state lead for Decoding Dyslexia Wisconsin, and thank you to the mom from Madison who spoke up. She probably said things almost better than I would say. But I was just thinking about the urgency question, and there was a lot of numbers, there was a lot of data, there were a lot of statistics pushed around, but ultimately, these are children. These are our children. I also left the workforce to school my 2 children who both have dyslexia, and I know of a lot of other parents in Dane County who have had to do the same. And it is an upheaval on our family. It's an economic burden. I eventually got trained to be a tutor, but the relationship with my daughter was so broken, and all of the trauma she had from learning how to read that we had to pay other tutors. So we still spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And so I think the urgency comes from these are people, these are children, and we just need to see them as children and work with the parents
And their
realize the
families.
bigger, and their families too. And I love that Mississippi has a plan in there for some parental involvement. I feel like that's a missing key. And I just appreciate you all. I don't really have a question. I have one question. I lost it when I was up here thinking. A lot of people are talking about curriculum. In the training that I received, I could work with any curriculum. It's about, would you agree, or what are your thoughts on? It's more about training than curriculum, because if someone is trained in strong skills and how to work independently with children, it's not really about curriculum. And I feel that some of the curriculum companies are very threatened by that, because I have multiple different curriculums I've worked with my kids, and if it doesn't work, I kind of just tweak that curriculum. I don't throw the whole curriculum out, but I'm still able to teach them in a systematic, explicit, direct way to what they need.
Well, if I could comment on that, one thing is you don't want to load more things onto the teacher's plate, right? So having to figure things out of a range of possibilities is something we want to reduce the range of decision making. How much of that they have to do so they can focus on the teaching. In my view, it's going to be a while before we get curricula that are modern and that really take advantage of all this stuff. We'll weed out the worst of them. And then teachers will still be trying to cope with the materials they have and supplementing them, which is what they're doing already. My view of this is we should be delivering tools for teachers that will work with any curriculum.
Absolutely.
And deliver what they need to know to teach the word does, or to teach whatever it is that is on the curriculum, on the scope and sequence that week, regardless of based on research, based on science, based on all these other things we know, that'll work with whatever curriculum they happen to be using. So they won't be stuck with the curriculum. They'll have the science of reading in there delivered to them in a way that they can use.
I was just going to say, I think it's a really good and important point. I think one of the things that is happening out there, though, is that teachers are learning about this stuff, teaching themselves by reading or going to some kind of training, and then they're left with, and what do I have? What materials do I have? And so they do
That's why we
need
need
help with that.
coaches.
Yeah.
Yes, coaches.
And the other problem is that even if you have the knowledge in the science of reading, your district may not want you to use evidence-based practices. We watched the movie last night, The Truth About Reading, and a teacher was called on the carpet. And they said, why are your scores much better? than everyone else. And she said, well, I can lie to you or I can tell you the truth. All right, tell me the truth. I'm not using your curriculum.
Yeah, but wouldn't it be much better if a teacher is knowledgeable, also has the materials for core instruction, and has the support for coaches from coaches to help them implement that? Because you're right, that's a unique skill. Because you have knowledge of the science of reading, you can point out a curriculum's flaws.
Absolutely.
It's very weak in this. So now I actually know what to go get. I know what to use in order to supplement that. First-year teachers don't know that, right? So we have to think about our seasoned teachers versus our new teachers that are very new to the profession that will say within 3 years, I'm out of here because I want to just be able to teach my kids. I want to be able to have my lesson plan and have my instructional materials and not have to try to ask everyone else what it is they think I need to do, what other materials do you have. So you're unique in that you actually know what to do, but you sometimes have to think about those who won't know what to do, and they are relying on that guidance and those materials and those things to be where they need to be and to do what they are intended to do in order for them to make sure that children are reading. So.
But this goes back full circle.
Yes.
This should be taught in college. Just in general, how do you teach kids to read? It should be taught in college.
That's right.
Then when you get out and you have a curriculum and you know it's not working, you'll know what to do to change it. That's, if you have that knowledge.
Confidently, too.
Confidently.
Yeah. And that's how we get the messages to the school boards. That's how we convince our administrators that something needs to change, how we convince our district superintendents that something needs to change because I'm using this and it's not giving me the outcomes that I need for my students. All right, I said one last question, but here you are. It's okay. She was, but you know what? It's okay.
Okay. I just couldn't help, and actually this is piggybacking on what you just said, and I'm Kim Feller from Feller School. I need help with helping other teachers, parents, and other leaders and educators with how to communicate knowledge about the science of reading without them feeling like their back is against the wall. I'm not one of those type of people that I'm not real, I would never try to put anybody in that position, but I've been in this position several times with school leaders, teachers, and parents all in one room, all advocating for what's best for the child, not having an understanding what everybody else understands, and people getting defensive because it's only natural, right? Because when you're a classroom teacher, I used to be a classroom teacher. I know. I'm the manager of my room. I'm responsible for these kids. I want to be the professional that I was in the classroom, and I don't want a parent come in and tell me that I'm not doing my job or that I should know something else. And this has been happening in situations, and I feel bad for the teachers because I used to be in the classroom. I feel bad because they don't know better. They just don't know, and so they're hanging on to the old stuff. The parents are educating themselves. They know what's going on in the classroom is not working. They want what's best. I mean, it's just, and then there are also this is really interesting too. So I also train teachers. Teachers pay with their own dime and their own time to go get the training, not telling their administrator.
Right. Okay, so.
Their heart is in the right place. They know what is right for the kid.
Yeah, so I'll say this. The first thing I'll say is that this is what a safe space looks like. So I appreciate you starting by saying, I need help. And we should create these safe spaces everywhere we go so that people can say, this is what I need help with. All right, so last question, lightning round. How can we begin to make this safe space in the school where they begin with the blame game? And my child's not reading, it's your fault, and well, I don't have the training that I need, or I don't have the materials that I need, or administrators are not supportive because maybe they don't know. So what can we say to those who really want to make sure that the conversations with the child at the center can become aligned. And I hope I'd summarize that.
Well, this is the million-dollar question. I think sharing information and knowledge is really crucial. And one of the reasons Emily's work has had an impact is because beyond what you can get from reading about it is it makes it very immediate. You hear from the people who are involved. It tells the story in a coherent way, and it's easy for people to understand without, and it's sympathetic. It's not blaming. Well, it's blaming Ken Goodman, but so her work had that effect of opening people's eyes, and that is one step. That is an important step. There are people. I should stop talking because I don't know the solution to this. Clearly, there are people who are well-intentioned, who have committed their lives to teaching under difficult circumstances, I might often, where they don't actually, they've got some ideas about reading that are making it harder for a lot of their kids to succeed. Those people face a kind of crisis. I'm a psychologist, but not that kind of psychologist. I don't know how you really convey things in a way. I think the notion that it is going to allow you to do what you want to do and be more effective is the best positive way I can think of bringing it to a teacher. And it's not about blaming them. I don't blame teachers. I go out of my way not to blame teachers, so I will blame people who taught them.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess when you think, I don't know the answer to this. I don't know the answer either. But I guess I think that I really think almost everyone, I'll just say everyone is well-intentioned here. I think that when you're sitting there in that room, everyone wants the same thing. It's just that they don't agree about how to get there, or maybe they don't even agree exactly on what the problem is. But I think it's just finding some way, same kind of it's kind of advice your therapist might give you, or if you go to couples counseling, let's try to clear away all the other stuff that's going on here and get to the thing at the center of the table here, which is we all want the best thing for the child. I'm not saying that that's going to work magic, but I think it's the only way. You have to somehow establish that and just be like, can we all just work on that? Can we all just agree there and figure that out together, even if we disagree about some things?
Senator Bell from Illinois was on a call with him the other day, and he said, we just need to put the kid in the center and work back from that.
That's right.
Yeah, all right.
Again, what's best for kids, right? They all say that too. I'm doing what's best for kids. And so I think, again, I'm going to go back to the grassroots. It can start in your classroom. It can start in your neighbor you're working with. You show them what you're doing. I've taken, I was on TikTok and I found this, or I was on social media and I found this. Hey, what do you think of this? Posing those questions, or just saying, I've been trying this. It's really been working. You want to see how this works? It's building those relationships and trust with people that you're working with, your administrators, your parents, and you work yourself up. And just sharing the new knowledge that you've been acquiring. This isn't going to change on a dime. People just are it's a funny thing in education when you're attacking what they've been doing is wrong. Well, no one wants to hear that. I mean, they just don't want to hear it, and rightfully so. So you have to. I always use the example, the analogy is that, would you go to a doctor that is practicing medicine from, never went back to school since the 90s? Just never went back to school. Would you do that? Of course not. You want the most up-to-date, technologically advanced procedure used on you. And we have to liken that to schools too, because reading is a science. Learning to read is a science. And if we're using the same techniques that we were taught 50 years ago, or even 30 years ago, we're going to be ineffective. In the past 5 years, I've been retired. I've learned more in 5 years than I have in my whole career. And that's because I'm actively involved in education, and I'm seeing what are things, the trends that are happening, things that are new that we haven't we're just discovering this now. And if you stay in a hole and you don't open yourself up to that, you have to have some curiosity at the very least to grow. And if you don't, you can't help those people. All you can do is what works for you.
So I would like to say thank you all so much for having us today. Thank you for Donna
Thank you.
Heitmanek,
Emily Hanford, Mark Seidenberg. This has been
Kymyona Burk.
I mean,
Kymyona Burk.
this has been such a pleasure. Thank you all.